purpose of this afternoon's meeting is to examine in detail the reasons for the huge projected cost overruns at the new Children's Hospital and the impact those increases will have on other capital projects in the health sector. On behalf of the committee, I would like to welcome you, Minister Harris, and Secretary-General of the Department, Jim Breslin, and Ms Fionnuala Duffy, Principal Officer. Thank you very much. I wish to draw your attention to the fact, by virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in relation to your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise or make charges against any persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I also wish to advise you that any opening statements you have made to the committee may be published on the committee's website after this meeting. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside of the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So before we commence, Minister, this is our third meeting in relation to this issue. As you know, we met with the Development Board of the hospital, and then last week we met with the Department and the HSE. And of course, that has amounted to almost 9 hours of evidence. And the issue is in relation to cost escalation, and it has been explained to us that the complexity of the process was at the heart of some of that cost escalation because it's a very complex project. The proposal is to build the best hospital in the world, that it would be a digital hospital, environmentally friendly, and also appropriate for patients and parents. The fundamental issue we have seen so far is in relation to the two-stage process, which did not properly determine the total cost of the project. And it would appear there was no total cost that the government put on the project. So the overall impression is that this has gone out of control and is going to have a knock-on effect on the capital project for years to come. So it's not just the Children's Hospital, it's the capital programme on other elements of health reform and expanding our capacity. In addition, we had requested that the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform would present it to the committee, and we're still issuing that invitation even though they haven't accepted it yet. So we are hopeful that they will come, because we feel they have a responsibility in relation to allocating the extra funding of up to 450 million, but also they would have had a part to play in the drawing up of government contracts. So on those two bases, we feel that they still should attend. So my first question and only question to you, Minister, is perhaps you would just give us your overall impression of what has happened here so we can get a sense of what the department feels is responsible for the cost escalation.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chairman, members of the Health Committee. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for facilitating my attendance in terms of the scheduling of the meeting as well, which I appreciate. I've watched very closely your committee hearings. I've watched nearly all of them, so I'm very much aware of the extensive engagement you've had and you'll continue to have, and indeed the Public Accounts Committee will have later this week, and indeed I'm back next week at this committee with all of HSE senior management for our quarterly exchange. So I know this is an issue we're going to continue to scrutinise and discuss, not just this afternoon, but I'm sure for quite some time. Let me say at the outset that when the overrun became apparent to me, it would be an understatement to say that I was very disappointed, very concerned and very frustrated. These are serious sums of money, these are taxpayers' money, and it's a very, very significant amount of money. So it is right and it is proper that we get to the bottom of exactly what happened, that we seek the answers, and that's why the government didn't just decide to proceed with the project. And I want to get to why we made that decision in a second, because that's a little bit lost in the conversations I've been following so far. We didn't just decide to proceed with the project, we decided to proceed with the project, but whilst doing so, to have an external review. And I want to make very clear to this committee that external review will be published, it will be brought to government, it will be shared with yourselves at the committee, and I'll expect everybody to come before this committee to answer questions. What I'm not going to do, though, is some of what I've seen creep into public debate. I'm not going to preempt the outcome of that in terms of where the accountability lies, because I think we've seen what happens when the Oireachtas doesn't afford people due process, and I don't think that's a very good way of carrying out our parliamentary business. But I do need to make three brief points. The first, this project is underway. I've heard people describe this project as a big hole in the ground in St James's. I've heard people, I think, in these committee rooms describe it as that. It isn't. It's actually being built. The building is underway. The outpatient urgent care centre in Donnelly is due to open in a couple of months. Sod is due to be turned on Tallaght. So this is a project that's finally underway. It was first discussed in the Oireachtas in 1962. About €40 million of taxpayers' money was wasted on the project trying to build it on the Mater site. It's now underway. We shouldn't lose sight of what it's doing. I've heard very detailed discussions about bed numbers and equating the entire cost of the project to bed numbers. I'd respectfully suggest that that somewhat misses the point. For example, our children's hospitals today have 14 theatres. This new National Children's Hospital will have 22 theatres. If you look at any of the data, Chairman, there will be more operations, more day case procedures, more inpatient procedures, more emergency department attendances catered for. There will be a new model of care. I heard people over the weekend say, why would you be building an expensive roof garden on the top of this hospital? Surely the children can go to the many parks we have in Dublin. That level of ignorance about the project doesn't understand that these are some of the sickest kids who will spend months and months in hospital. So yes, this is a very, very expensive project. And none of what I have said is to take away from my serious concerns about the cost overrun. But the last point I want to make is, when you're a minister, you're presented with options. When the cost overrun became apparent to my department in August, and the level and scale of that became apparent to my department in November, when we then engaged with other colleagues across government and then brought it to government in December for a decision, I really had three options, Chairman, that I could make. First option was pause the project. I'm not pausing the building of the National Children's Hospital. It's been paused far too many times. There are kids who are now adults who have kids who are hoping to have benefited from the National Children's Hospital. Second option was retender the project. Have a chat with the builder, I heard somebody suggest. All of the expert evidence was retendering the project would have cost more for the taxpayer above and beyond this very significant cost already, and would have also increased the length of time it would take to deliver this project, which is also already well overdue in terms of the expectation of the Irish people. And the third option was to proceed. And that's the decision that I took. It was one of the hardest decisions that the government's made in my time in government, certainly the hardest decision I've asked the government to make. Because if this was any other project, you might be saying, hang on a second, we can't go any further with this. But we couldn't actually stop this project because it's so badly needed in terms of the infrastructure for our children. The overrun is very significant, and I'm not in any way deviating from that, undermining the significance of that. This is massive. And you're quite right, Chairman, to highlight that as our members of this committee. But it's not an overrun of €1 billion, as I've heard people reference at this committee. That's comparing apples with oranges. It's going back to a time of a different site without planning permission in a different time. That's like trying to pretend you were building your house on a different site 10 years ago, because I've heard a lot of analogies about houses. That's not what we're doing. The comparison in terms of the overrun is the figure that I brought to government in 2017 with the figure today, and that's an increase of about 450 million. It's a colossal overrun. No getting away from that, but it's not €1 billion. The comparative figure is 450 million euro. You've heard in great detail from people who've come before this committee as to how they were arrived at that point. You've scrutinised whether the GMP process was the right one to use. I do need to point out that this was something recommended by our various procurement bodies, by the Government's Contracts Committee, by all of the expert advice available. And the Mazars report does also suggest that this was actually the appropriate way to go, whilst highlighting significant concerns in terms of oversight. I have no doubt, Chairman, when the PwC report comes back in March, that there are going to need to be changes and improvements in terms of how this project is managed and overseen. There's no doubt about that. There are powers available to me under the existing legislation that was only passed by the Oireachtas in recent weeks. So I will assess all of the options available to me when that report is published, when we actually have all of the facts in front of us as well. I've heard a couple of other comments made about de-scoping the project. Again, there's very little value in doing that without actually compromising the safety standards seems to be the expert view. I've heard lots of different opinions, but you've got to remember we have a situation with construction inflation. We had a situation in relation to design fees as well. And there's no doubt, absolutely no doubt, that the government, of which I'm a collective part, is extraordinarily disappointed, frustrated and worried in relation to this. We are going to get to the bottom of it. There's learnings not just for this capital project, which is the largest health capital project in the history of our state, but for every other capital project as well. I won't be found wanting in terms of making sure that the lessons are learned, that the learning is implemented, and that changes where necessary are made. But I am going to await the report. But what I'm not going to do is entertain any talk of pausing the project, moving the project. I'm reading articles today, I think, about moving it to a greenfield site. This hospital is being built. It's underway. The children of Ireland need it. Yes, it's expensive, perhaps too expensive, but we've got to get this project now done.
Minister, thank you very much. So our first contributor is Deputy Stephen Donnelly.
Thank you, Chair, Minister, Mr Breslin, Ms Duffy, thank you very much for your time today. Minister, it is an understatement to say that the public and healthcare professionals and patients and patient groups and their families are furious at what they are finding out about the cost overruns on this hospital. And there are three main questions I'm being asked. What happened? First question is, how was this allowed to happen? The second question is, why is there apparently zero accountability for what has happened? And the third question is, what can be done now that we know what we know? So they're the three questions I'd like to get into with you. On the first question of how did this happen, I disagree with you on your figures. This isn't about a cost overrun of 450 million. 450 million is just the latest cost overrun, but it is a fact that in April 2016, Leo Varadkar went on the 6-1 News and stated that the total cost, including VAT, including contingency, including inflation, including the satellites, was going to be 650 million euro. That's what he said. And he was the Minister for Health at the time, and about 4 weeks later he was the Taoiseach. And if we go back to the documents from 2016, that's the figure we see. It crept up from about 400 million to about 650 million. And when it got to 650 million, Leo Varadkar stated that's what the cost was going to be. 2 years later, the cost was 1.7 billion. So we can argue about the roundings, but the total increase from 2016 to 2018 is about €1 billion. We know that there's not going to be a single extra bed provided for that. Now, in a normal hospital, it costs about €1 million to commission a hospital bed. So in a normal country, building normally priced hospitals, for that overrun of €1 billion, you'd get about 1,000 hospital beds. We're getting 0 hospital beds.
Sorry, I know you had 3 questions at the beginning there. do you want to proceed to those answers?
No, I'm going to just, I'm okay, Chair.
Okay.
Thank you. The first question I have is, when you found out that the costs had now escalated to €1.7 billion, why did you not instruct your officials and/or the board to design some of that cost back out? Because it was never intended that anything like that amount of money would be spent.
So,
And just, what we have decided, ministers, we're going to give each deputy or senator 10 minutes forwards and backwards.
sure.
So if you be concise with your answers in as much as possible. Yeah. Thank you.
Other questions? I will indeed. So just to be clear, firstly, small point: the Taoiseach didn't go from being Minister for Health to Taoiseach.
Social protection.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
So the only figure that can be compared with Deputy Donnelly is the figure that the government signed off on when the project had been tendered. I mean, that's the only figure that I can stand over, the figure that the Government of Ireland approved when a government decision went to it, brought by me in April 2017. But I get the broader point, and I don't want to get into the semantics. So, I mean, that's the figure that I believe this project could be compared with. It doesn't change your argument, because it's still a very significant overrun of 450 million in relation to that figure. Your point about beds is one that somewhat frustrates me when I hear it, because it is ignoring the reality here. It's trying to suggest that there's no additional benefit to the new hospital other than maybe a nice building.
No, it's not.
Good.
It's not
good,
at all.
Because there's sick kids today in Crumlin, in Temple Street, in Tala, with their parents sleeping on the floor. Every kid is going to have a single ensuite room. Really good for infection control. Really good for just basic family decency when people are spending weeks and months in hospitals. That's the first point. Second point is there's 14 theatres. There's going to be 22 theatres. That's a very, very significant increase in the number of theatre, in the amount of theatre capacity that we're actually going to have to look after our sick kids in Ireland.
The point I'm making, Minister, you're answering a different question.
Well, you made a point about beds.
The point I'm making is that for the billion euro, be it 500 million or a billion euro, for hundreds of millions of extra, based on what was originally designed for the new Children's Hospital, there are no extra operating theatres, there are no extra beds. That's the point. It's not relative to today. It's relative to what we were meant to be getting for 650 million.
I don't accept that, because we can't build the hospital without the 1.7 billion euro, which is going to deliver all of these services for our kids that they don't currently have today. And that is the reality in relation to the situation. So we shouldn't have parents of sick children watching this today, watching these proceedings, presuming that there's very little added benefit to their kids in terms of health outcomes, because that wouldn't be the case. It's also important to say...
Just to be clear, no one on this committee in the last 3 weeks has suggested that once.
Okay, well, I've heard you talk about the Children's Hospital purely as though we're counting beds. And remember, the number of beds wasn't picked by me, it wasn't plucked from the air. The number of beds was designed with paediatricians as to what would be an appropriate level
Sorry,
of beds.
I do apologise for talking over you. I'm halfway through my time and you haven't answered the question yet, which is, when you found out about the 1.7 billion euro, why didn't you instruct them to reverse out some of those costs?
I'll answer all of the questions, and my Secretary-General would also like to comment on that, but I'm also going to come back on other points that you're making, because I'm not going to let them just sit in relation to the beds point. In relation to the 1.7 billion, just to be very clear in relation to the chronology, and I've told my officials to share everything and anything with this committee. I've heard Deputy Kelly's point in relation to this. There should be full transparency in relation to this. I want that to happen. I first became aware of this, I think, on the 24th of August, that there was going to be an overrun. The final figure I didn't become aware of, I think, until the 9th of November, certainly early November. I can check my folder in a moment. I think it was the 9th of November. In the intervening period of time, I had been assured by my officials, and indeed asked by my officials, that due diligence be done in relation to all of the options. Look at how we can actually claw back the cost of this project. Look at, are there better ways of delivering the project? The Mazars report was commissioned. A report came back through the National Paediatric Hospital Development Board and told me that after all of this due diligence, here were your three options. We do need to, when we talk about the National Paediatric Hospital Development Board, these are not random individuals. These are really serious people with expertise in relation to the delivery of major construction projects. There was a number of reports, many of which have been shared with this committee, in relation to the different options, including scoping. And I was satisfied and remain satisfied that all of those issues were looked at. I also remain satisfied, based on the expert advice available to me, that if you were to actually try to de-scope the hospital, that you'd actually be getting into the realm of impacting on basic standards and safety standard directives as well.
Can I ask you then, as a follow-up to that, is it therefore the case, so you've stated that you looked at the 1.73 billion and concluded that it was not worth trying to reverse out some of those costs. Can I ask, is that still the government's position, that you are proceeding with 1.73 billion, and is the PwC report, as part of its terms of reference, to try and de-escalate the costs that have spiralled?
Yes, it's a short answer. So the government rules nothing out in terms of trying to further reduce the costs of this project. I do need to point out, when you talk about 1.7 billion, it's not all exchequer funding. I know it's a relatively small point, but I do need to make that point. So the government hasn't signed off on a figure of 1.7 billion of capital costs for the National Children's Hospital. That is an important point to make. So I am satisfied. I'm satisfied enough that I made a recommendation to the government that we proceed with this project. I couldn't think of what alternative recommendation would be worthy of the children of Ireland. So I made the recommendation to proceed with the project. The government considered it as a collective and decided to proceed. But the government didn't do so delighted. The government did so really frustrated. And you're right, that is an understatement. These words, frustrated, disappointment, are understatements, such as the scale. We'll be led by the PwC report in terms of what further avenues are available, and I can assure you, Deputy, if there are further avenues available, we won't be found wanting. I don't want to get into your time, but the Secretary...
Can I ask now, I'd prefer if
2 minutes.
Yeah, I prefer... We'll talk about... Anyway, I'd prefer to keep with the Minister, if that's okay, if you don't mind, Mr. Breslin. Thank you. I want to talk about accountability, because what we've heard here over the last few weeks, I have to say, has shocked me and has shocked a lot of people. At 1.7 billion euro,
yes, the
cost per bed is going to be more than twice as much as the cost per bed as the most expensive hospitals built anywhere in the world. Right? And whether we use your figure of 450 million or the figure of $1 billion on an overrun, it is a vast amount of money to have overrun by, with massive knock-on implications for the healthcare system. Do you accept as Minister that this represents a catastrophic failure of financial management?
I've heard you ask. In fairness, you're consistent on this because you've asked every witness this. I'll arrive at my conclusion on that question. I'll come back to this committee and I'll answer that question when I see the PwC report. Why would I be commissioning a report if I predetermined the outcome to that?
But Minister, with respect, you've known about this since August. I mean, you must have a view.
No, that's factually incorrect. I'm not going to stand over factual incorrect information. I haven't known about this since August. I've known that there was an overrun since August. I've known about the figures in relation to the scale of that overrun from the 9th of November, and I appraised the government of that on the 18th of December when we made a decision. We're now in the month of January. We've approved the project just before Christmas, and I'm now awaiting the outcome of the PwC report, which is not a never-ever report. It'll be here in March. It'll be published in full, and I'll come back here and answer your questions in relation to that. Can I just make one tiny point, because you're asking what else can we do to mitigate cost, which I think is an important point. We do also have other options available. For example, what is the future of Crumlin Hospital? A hospital that under its own rules needs to be used for the future of children's healthcare is an interesting point. Obviously philanthropy, which I know I've heard your views on it as well, but it is a normal part of the delivery of children's healthcare right throughout the globe. We see an awful lot of it in the UK. So there has been the establishment of a new foundation. So there are other options that we are considering in relation to this. But the board are very clear from government.
But just on the board, because this is my last question, Chair, I appreciate that. So just on the board, you have in the past, in light of healthcare scandals, expressed no confidence in healthcare professionals, for example. This, to me, and to many people around Ireland, is an absolute scandal. What has happened with taxpayers' money that needs to be deployed for healthcare and for children's healthcare. Two quick questions. Do you, at this point, have confidence in the Development Board, and have you asked anybody to resign in light of everything that we now know has happened?
So I think people are entitled to due process here. You have confidence in boards and individuals as they do their job. Should that position change, they'll be notified first in relation to that. I'm awaiting the outcome of the PwC report. I did reference under Children's Health Ireland, and we maybe can be slightly flexible with the time because I don't want to eat up Deputy Donnelly's time. I did reference under the new Children's Health Ireland Act, which you would have supported the passage of. I do have powers in relation to the future composition of the board. So I'll consider all of these options. And indeed, I'll welcome the input of this committee, and I'll be happy to engage on it when I have the PwC report. I haven't asked anybody to resign because I think the appropriate thing to do here is allow due process, and then I'll certainly decide where the accountability must rest. But there will need to be accountability. Something went majorly wrong here. Of that, we're not in disagreement. I just want to actually establish all of the facts in line with the government decision and then decide how best to proceed.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Donnelly. Now, Deputy Louise O'Reilly.
Thanks very much, Chair, and welcome to you all. With regard to PwC, the company that you're going to be using to conduct this report, albeit at this late stage, is that the PwC also the on-site compliance managers for BAM in this project? Am I correct to that? You might be able to answer that for us. And with regard to the board, Minister, are the government represented on the National Paediatric Hospital Development Board? If they are, who is the representative? And can you just outline for us briefly, maybe round it up to the nearest 10 or 20, if that might suit, the number of meetings that you would have had with this person, or communications, or how they communicated to you? Because you will understand and appreciate, I'm sure, that there's a certain amount of incredulity that the person with whom the buck should stop appears to be in the dark for a very, very long time about a project that is incurring a massive overrun. So not finding out until August that this is happening, really at what stage were you kept appraised? Was there constant communication? Was there any communication? We know from the chairman of the board that he met you, but only at social events, so that there wouldn't have been formal meetings between yourself and the chair, but maybe there was between yourself and whoever was the government representative. Just with regard to the page 2 of the document that we were given in advance of this, under the bottom table, comparison of total increased costs. So under 2.1, increase in quantities, 115 million euros. Perhaps you might tell us the exact date that you were notified of this increase. And likewise, the point 2.3, omissions in stage 1 design / bill of quantities, 20 million euros. So again, you might advise us at what exact stage you knew about that, because they're fairly substantial sums of money. So at what stage did you know about those? And also, what, if anything, you might have done to maybe take some action at that stage, or maybe you were just waiting on another report. The chairman of the board advised us that while there were significant lessons to be learned, he wouldn't change any of the actions that he had taken. Now, that sort of drew a fair degree of response from the committee, because actually the actions taken have led us to this situation where there is a massive / catastrophic / whatever term you want to use yourself, but it's certainly a huge cost overrun. The Chair was at pains to point out that lessons were learned. I have to say, I'm not exactly convinced, but he did say that. Minister, do you think that you have learned any lessons from this, and you might share with us what those lessons are, and what indeed could have been done that wasn't done, and what will be done differently? And my final question, so I'd put all my questions together and then give you loads of time to answer. I am indeed. My final question is, An Taoiseach has said that projects will be delayed / deferred, possibly cancelled altogether because of this overrun. So you might outline for us, because I know that there are people who are waiting on hospital beds in their community. There's people in Limerick, there's people in Donegal, there's people right across the state, people in Monaghan, waiting on projects in their area, really vital, important local projects to put the capacity in that we all agree we need. How are those projects going to be impacted by the failure to maintain the costs, or to contain the cost of the Children's Hospital? Thank you.
Deputy O'Reilly, thank you very much. Minister, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. The PwC report, a decision was taken by government to externally review, and the PwC report was commissioned by the HSE. I might just ask the Secretary General in a moment. I'll maybe do all of mine first to come in relation to your very specific question, which I don't know the answer to. In relation to, you've made the point just about, not finding out about the cost overrun until this late stage. I would just have to refer you to the Mazars report, which does point out that actually the GMP process, the two-stage procurement, actually exposed a cost overrun at an early stage of the project, where under traditional procurement models you wouldn't find out about this often until after the actual overrun had occurred. So we now know at a fairly early stage in this project about a projected overrun, and therefore it does allow us focus on what do we do collectively to actually try to rein that in. The Secretary General will speak to his briefing note that he circulated in a moment, but in relation to, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you're asking me when did I know about the specific cost overruns.
Well, I'm so sorry. I'm using those as an illustrative example. Okay, so they're
Which two? Sorry,
increasing. So it's page 2. Increase in quantities 115 million. Omissions in stage 1 design bill 20 million. Just by way of example, because it does appear to people, Minister, that no watch was being kept on the costs. That's how it appears. So perhaps there was, but we just want to know at what stage you were made aware of it, because the costs didn't just escalate in one single amount. They escalated. It was a whole load of different amounts. So just at what stage were you kept appraised? And more specifically, there is a government representative on the board. How often did you meet with this person?
Deputy O'Reilly, Minister.
So I became aware of the overrun and the components of the overrun in November. My Secretary General reminds me, I think it's the 9th of November. In relation to my keeping in touch on the governance structure, so the way the governance structure was established, my Secretary General obviously chairs the steering committee. My Secretary General keeps me informed on the various components, report into the Secretary General. Secretary General and myself would have had many discussions and engagements on the National Children's Hospital. I think there's been 12 memos brought to government on the National Children's Hospital since 2012, including a number brought by me. So that's how I was kept informed in relation to the situation. In terms of the composition of the board, the future of the board, and all of those matters, they'll be considered by me when I receive the PwC report and publish it. You say, why didn't you take some action? I think was your phrase, take some action or take some action. I'm just, and I understand you're the one asking the questions, but I mean, people might start illustrating what action you would have liked me to take at this stage.
Well, perhaps to engage with the board.
So I engaged with the Secretary-General in accordance with the governance structures.
But you asked me a question, Minister,
Yeah,
and my answer
that's
is
what you would have done.
that perhaps you could have engaged with the board.
And what would your my engagement have changed in terms of the reality? There were expert reports done, and they gave me 3 options, and I outlined them in my informal opening statement: to proceed, to pause, or to re-tender. They were the 3 options that existed. Now, Deputy Donnelly's right. Are there other things we can do to claw back costs? Very eager to look at that, and we are, and we will. But there was no magic option here that would deliver the Children's Hospital, all that was meant to be in it, all the various components, the satellite centres, and the new model of care, and not be met with a €1.7 billion bill. I mean, that was the conundrum.
But I think what people are interested in is how it got from the Taoiseach's, now Taoiseach, then Minister for Health's figure, to the current figure, and at what stage. I mean, we do use the analogy of building a house or getting an extension built, but really they went for the lowest bidder. Nobody asked a question. By €131 million, the lowest bidder, nobody said at what point, how can they deliver it. I mean, you only have to look at page 3 of your statement to see the difference between the tender price and the actual, what was called the guaranteed maximum price, which turned out to be a slightly movable figure and not really guaranteed at all. But you can see there how those were all moving. And the questions are very simple. How did that happen? It happened on your watch for most of it. How did we get from €630 million all in, satellites, VAT and everything it was supposed to be, to this stage?
If we're using people's watches, just to be clear, the figure that I brought to government was 983 million. So if you're going to talk about what happened during my tenure,
you remember the government. So I mean, the question that people want to know is, how did it go?
In the interest of time, can we allow the Minister to answer the question?
There was a moment where you promised I'd have loads of time to answer your questions. €983 million was the figure that I brought to the government in April 2017. €1.4 billion was the revised figure that I appraised the government of on, I think it was the 18th of December, when we decided to proceed with Phase B. So I mean,
but when
that
you
is
brought
the difference.
the 900, the just under a billion
Sure,
figure,
983. Yeah.
did you ask any questions as to how the statement made by the man who was the Taoiseach by that stage, it had been the Minister for Health, how that escalated?
Yes, and that was all listed in detail at the time in relation to the government decision. But you've got to remember, we're talking about. I hate this building a house analogy because I think it's overly simplistic intentionally, right? Because we're not building houses. We're trying to actually do something extraordinarily unique and complex that we've never done before, that successive governments have promised and not delivered, and we're going to deliver it. But if you do want to use the building house analogy, a hell of a lot happens in terms of construction inflation. A hell of a lot happened in terms of the type of house you decided to build. There were also decisions in relation to sprinklers and VAT that I know some people wish to trivialise, but there were lots of different decisions and elements that were made, and all of which have been documented, many of which has been shared with this committee. The PwC report is going to, warts and all, find out, was there a better way? It's going to look and see, was everything correctly done? And I'm going to act on the findings of that report and won't be found wanting. You've asked a very important question about other projects and what impact on other projects, and there's no two ways about it. Capital budgets are finite. If you're spending more on one project, obviously that eats into the available resources for other projects. The government is aware of that, was aware of it on the 18th of December when we decided as a government 50 million would have to come this year from my capital budget in the Department of Health and the HSE, and 50 million from across the rest of government. The Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform is to return to government, it's a matter for him, with how he proposes to divide that. We have been clear, the Taoiseach has been very clear on the record of the Dáil that no project will be cancelled, but will some be delayed? Yes, that is likely. What I'm currently doing is working through the priority projects in my department and prioritising issues like capacity, and I will agree with the HSE a capacity plan for 2019 in the coming weeks. A capital plan for 2019 in the coming weeks.
Thank you very much, Minister. I'm now going on to move on to...
I asked a very brief question about the PwC being the on-site managers for BAM, and Mr Breslin said he would answer it.
Perhaps you might come back to that.
It would take 2 seconds.
Mr Breslin, and maybe Alan Kelly might have it included in his questions. So, Deputy Kelly, 10 minutes.
Best of luck. Firstly, just in relation to transparency, and I know the Minister made reference to it. By the way, may I start by congratulating you and your wife on your fantastic arrival. Health and happiness to the three of you. From a transparency point of view, I've asked a number of parliamentary questions, and the Secretary-General, in fairness, came back to me today. But I actually had to go to the County Corla and go directly to you to actually get the information, which is pretty basic information. That shouldn't happen. It shouldn't happen. The information, looking for dates of board meetings and steering group meetings, that's a pretty basic question to ask. So please don't let it happen again. Because for me, I get worried when departments don't answer specific questions. So please take that on board, right? Because I have a number of other questions gone in, and I expect them to be answered. Also, 2 weeks ago, at a committee meeting here, members of the board, the hospital board were here. They were to come back, Chair, with a number of questions that were to be answered for a number of us here. I had a load of them. I haven't got an iota of them. That's not acceptable. It's 2 weeks later. My main questions are, Minister, I mean, what happened between August and December is bugging me deeply. You were told on the 24th of, your department was told on the 24th. You were told in a submission on the 27th. Correct. I presume you'll send that submission on to us.
Sure.
Okay. And at that stage, it was still the 983. It was at 983. It was 983, but you knew there was a problem.
Yes.
And the problem, which I'm not going to get because I haven't time, but I broke it down in 2 weeks ago with the board. The 140 plus 60, and then the extra 250, so brought up to 450. We broke it down as regards to all the costs there. But I have a question here, Minister. On the 18th of September, you answered a parliamentary question where you said it was still 983. But you knew it wasn't 983 because you've been informed on the 24th of August or the 27th of August, whichever date we pick, that it was going to be significantly higher. Why didn't you answer the parliamentary question by saying it was going to be higher than 983? First question. The second question, when did you inform the Taoiseach, either formally or informally, that we had a problem? Formally or informally, that there was an issue? What date after the 24th of August did you inform the Taoiseach that we had a problem here? Next question. A real issue as regards to structures here. Structures here are quite confusing to the public. So what you have is, you have the National Board, and according to our witnesses, that board reports in to a steering committee which is chaired by Mr Sullivan, which then reports in to a board which is chaired by yourself, Mr Breslin, which then obviously reports to the Minister. In August, the Minister or the Department was informed by the board, the original board, the board of the hospital itself, that there were issues here. Did that board not have to report through the steering committee? When was Mr Sullivan told? And when did Mr Sullivan tell Mr Breslin? Or did the board bypass Mr Sullivan and go straight to yourselves? When was the Chief Executive of the HSE acting told about these issues? Why was there a meeting held in the HSE in somewhere around the middle of November, where effectively it was news to most people at the highest level in the HSE about this issue?
Just to give the Minister an opportunity to answer within the time allotted.
And then my last question. The 1.73 billion, does that include an escalation in the cost of maintenance of this building? So in other words, given the fact that this has arisen and gone so high, have they multiplied the maintenance costs as well, or is that going to escalate this figure even higher, which I understand it will?
Thank you, Deputy.
Very specific questions, so please don't ignore any of them.
Minister, if you can be concise.
I will. I'll ask Mr President in a moment to take some of the when questions that I think he's better appraised of. Thank you for your good wishes, Deputy. On the transparency thing, shouldn't have happened. I've been very clear to my officials. Show everything to this committee, share everything with this committee and indeed other committees of the House as appropriate, and put all the information out there. Disappointed that you've had information that's not back from the members of the Development Board. I presume and we'll undertake to follow that. I'm sure they're watching and they need to get that information to this committee as well. In terms of the timeline, and you're asking me, I suppose, what did I know after, as you correctly say, what did I do rather, after my department knew on the 24th of August there was an emerging issue. I was informed, as you correctly say, on the 27th of August. So what happened between then and maybe going to government on the 18th of December, I presume, is the question. So when I was advised on the 27th of August, I was advised that there was still work to be done. I was advised that the National Paediatric Hospital Development Board had to do work with its legal and design teams as a first step, and then the board would be better able to actually advise the department on next steps and what options should be done. The board sought and subsequently obtained a 3-month window to conclude its GMP negotiations without incurring additional costs, and this is important and goes to your next question. There were significant commercial sensitivities here. As late as the 19th of September, at a board meeting, which I think was meeting number 6 of that board of the CHP&P board, they were told that there were still challenges relating to a delay in completing the negotiations with the main contractor. So if one of the issues here, Deputy, is protecting the taxpayer and trying to get the best deal for the taxpayer, there was significant ongoing engagement and negotiation with the main contractor. And that's
so that explains the answer to the PQ on the 18th of September.
Yes, but I am satisfied that the PQ on the 18th of September was an accurate and factual account of the situation at that time.
Couldn't it be?
Well, it was, but I'm not being argumentative on this, but the government hadn't made a decision in relation to even
You knew the costs were higher.
The government hadn't made a decision in relation.
You knew the costs were higher.
I knew that the costs were likely to increase, but I didn't know the figure. I also knew that there were commercially sensitive negotiations ongoing. The question, and I've reread it, read it again, the question was quite specific in relation to was the project on profile and the likes from my memory, and also the government hadn't made a decision in relation to proceed with Phase B. There was even contingency planning being done should the government decide not to proceed by the board as well. When did I inform the Taoiseach? Informally or formally, you asked. So in the first conversation I think I had with the Taoiseach was in November. In relation, I don't have the specific date. I'll get it for you, but it was in November. I believe that was the first.
Secretary General, when did you inform the Taoiseach's department?
No.
Formally or informally?
November. Yeah.
What date? Might come back to us. Both of you.
Come back to you on the date. Mine was in November. We then engaged with. It was ongoing engagement, as you can imagine, between my own department and the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform in terms of what are we going to do, and in terms of bringing a memo to government to advise the government on the next steps as well. I think I've answered your specific questions. The Secretary General might answer the questions about the dates in terms of structures and who knew what, if that's okay with you, Deputy Colleague.
So in terms of dates, and I can appreciate from the committee that the suddenness of the escalation in this is posing a question for you on the timing. It's that very issue that is at the heart of this. And the records will show this, and so I can say it now, but I know it will be borne up by the records. Everything I say will be verified by the records that will be supplied in relation to this. In August, the HSE and the department were briefed on the worrying trend within the escalation of the GMP price. The GMP, the Guaranteed Maximum Price process, was still underway and did not conclude till November. Up to that point, if you look at Table 1, which is the 61 million, that had been declared as a cost escalation.
Where that?
No other escalation had been declared. We then have a warning, a very loud warning siren from the Development Board saying we are now seeing work packages coming back from this process, particularly on the mechanical and electrical, which are outside of what we had expected and planned. We are facing very serious discussions with all of the contractors. We are in a commercial process, but we are significantly concerned. From that moment, the department and the HSE were concerned, but not fully appraised of where this was going to end up. We spent all of our efforts insisting with the Development Board that every resource be put at that process, and meanwhile that other aspects, external reviews, audits were undertaken to validate.
I just want to remind you of my questions.
Yep.
My questions relating to the reporting mechanism.
Yes.
When did the chief? My three outstanding questions are: the largest one was the one about the reporting mechanisms, because there's 4 layers.
Yeah.
Who knew what when, and was it in that order, or was somebody bypassed? Second one is: when did the chief executive of the HSE was he informed specifically? And third one was in relation to maintenance costs. The first was very important because there are 4 layers here. To the public outside, there's a hospital board, there's a steering committee, there's a board over that steering committee, and then there's yourself, Minister. Now, we need transparency on
Just
that.
1 minute. Yeah,
Let me give that to you. The first thing to say is all of this is within the responsibility of the Paediatric Hospital Development Board. Those other entities, the Children's Hospital and so on, they were not involved in those commercial negotiations. They were being fully handled by the Development Board. The department was briefed in November, as is set out in Section 4, saying the review of cost escalation. They were briefed at an individual level. Very quickly thereafter, and you will see it in the note that's gone to you this morning, the steering group, which is chaired by the HSE, met on the 27th of August. I know myself, I came back from leave in the first week in September. I was briefed at that stage. We had a board meeting on the 19th of September where we got a verbal update on the GMP process. We were concerned at that stage. When I came back off my leave, and I'll be open and honest with you, because it's been said here at the committee, my first impression was this is contractors who have a reputation for seeking to extract significant amounts through processes, doing what they may be known to be have done in the past, and that's been said at the committee. And that was the first uninformed view I had. I set about informing myself on the process, going through it in detail at the board. The next place, because that did not bear scrutiny, the next place that I went was this is scope creep and user creep, where users have expanded the project. You'll see in the information that's provided to you today, there's 20 million in relation to that. The users would say they identified things that just had to be fixed. So that's not the primary explanation. The primary explanation is in the figures that have been set out to you today. It's in the gap between the first preliminary design and the final design, and the shift in the quantities and the omissions that had to then be costed in that process. And those costings were only coming through as the GMP process was concluded. And that ran all of the way up to November. When it was concluded, we were in a position to make a fully informed recommendation to government, and we did so in December.
Chief Executive and Maintenance, just two quick
Mr.
answers.
President, thank you very much.
I presume Chief Executive was informed by his deputy, may have been on leave at the end of August, but if not, at the end of August or shortly thereafter. The Chief Executive sits on, or the Director General sits on, the board which we convened in September, so you would have known well in advance of that.
Maintenance costs?
On the maintenance, once you expand the floor area of the facility, you are going to incur maintenance. Having said that, the type of fit-out and the type of energy that has been put into this project is expected to yield significant operational savings through energy efficiency and good design.
Are those
President,
costs
thank you very
included?
much. I'm now going to move on to our next contributor, and if we're all disciplined, we'll get back in on a second round. So, Deputy O'Connell or Deputy Durkan? Deputy Durkan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome the Minister and our expert witnesses. Can I ask a simple question? When it became known that there was an overrun, a significant overrun, albeit based on the final analysis, if you like, previously you had a sketchy appraisal of what was going to happen. Was any consideration given to deleting any part of the project? And what effect would it have if that were done?
So, the scale of the challenge we faced, and it's important to reflect on the scale of that challenge, was 450 million on an existing budget of 900 million. So to get back from 1.4 billion to your original budget, you would have had to de-scope the project by a third. That was the scale of the challenge that we faced. In doing so, and this is where the expert advice came into play, in doing so, external expert advice, in doing so, you would have had to redesign the hospital. You would have potentially extracted services out of that hospital that would have undermined the potential to amalgamate the three hospitals in the process if you went at it at that scale. But even if you went at it in a more modest way, you would have been redesigning the hospital. The chances are you would have had to do something to the external fabric of the hospital. Therefore, you would have had to resubmit a new planning application, and you would have had to re-tender. The likelihood is you would add 3 years from that point forward before you could award a contract and commence construction again. In the kind of inflationary environment we're in, we had 2016 prices locked in. At 10% inflation in 17, 18, halfway through this year, add in inflation over the remaining period, the likelihood is you would have ended up with an inferior project, an inferior hospital, at something approaching the same costs that we're presented with today. In fact, you would probably have ended up in such a situation that you would have said, we really just can't continue on that. You would have deferred the building of this project for a generation. You would have come back out in the heat of an inflationary market with a higher price, or at least a price along the lines of what we're looking at, but with a project that doesn't deliver. And we would have ended up in a bigger mess, and I absolutely agree this is a mess. I'm totally unhappy with the situation we're in. But we would not have built a hospital in that situation. The situation we're in now is absolutely invidious, but we are going to build a hospital that has been required in this country for 30 years.
Would a different site has been suggested in some quarters? Would that have made a significant difference? And if so, what significance?
So the 983 to the 1.4 is all on the same site. There's absolutely no significance to the cost escalation around the site.
But there are those...
Just on the issue, on that issue. So first of all, I don't think there is evidence to back up that question you're asking, Deputy Durkan. We also have to remember the reason the site was chosen, and I certainly don't intend to reopen that debate. But this is not just about building a block of apartments or a house. We had to build it in the place for the best medical outcomes. And the very clear advice available to me, and I made this decision, and I know Deputy Kelly was a minister in a previous government that considered all of these matters as well. This was about putting the site in the best possible hospital and putting it co-located with an adult acute teaching hospital provided a level of care and improved health outcomes that other sites wouldn't have offered. So I've heard about, even now, I was saying at the start, even now this idea of build it on a greenfield site ignores the fact that it's already underway, but also ignores the fact that what we're actually trying to do here at the end of the day is have a hospital that's going to improve kids' outcomes. And you have a situation today where sick teenage kids are going, adolescents are going from Crumlin to James's already for their cancer care. The idea that you wouldn't try to co-locate them on the side of James's is really missing the point. And ultimately, we can try locate there with a maternity hospital as well, and have a state-of-the-art campus that can look after people from birth right through there.
In the current situation, Mr. Chairman, we're getting what 8 new theatres. 8 new theatres.
14 to 22, yeah.
And for example, I'm not suggesting it, but it has been suggested that less theatres would do. Would that have made a significant contribution to A, the cost, and B, to the status of the hospital?
So one of the things we're going to get is a 26% increase in day cases here. So it goes back to the question of whether this hospital should be all about beds or should have other facilities in it. And the theatre provision is part of rapidly moving children through, because it's not good paediatric practice if you can avoid it to keep a child in overnight. You want to get them back home. So actually having good ambulatory theatres, having good outpatient facilities, having 5 MRIs, when we don't have that, we have at most 1 in each of the constituent hospitals. So the investment in diagnostics, in theatres, in ambulatory, and the 2 centres in Blanchardstown and Tala are absolutely essential to the model of care that we're seeking to provide. That wouldn't be a place I would start to de-scope.
What about the 6,000 rooms, Mr. Chairman? A lot of people, natural question would be, what's in those rooms? Now, I have an idea what's involved, but for the record, perhaps we could address that issue.
Yes, so I think one of the important points is you're going to a situation now, Deputy Durkan, whereby actually our consultants and our clinicians are not going to necessarily have dedicated office space in every scenario. They're actually going to, hot desk is probably the wrong word, but they're actually going to be moving around the hospital. So we're certainly not building a hospital with copious amounts of meeting rooms and office space. In fact, quite the contrary. But what we are doing is making sure that our kids have modern fit for purpose facilities that they don't have today. I don't need to tell you, Deputy Durkan, but like the idea of your son or daughter spending months in hospital and you sleeping on the bedroom floor, the idea of Florence Nightingale type wards instead of single rooms for infection control, en suites, having proper research facilities, having a school, having proper recreational space for kids who may not be able to get outdoors, having more theatre space, having MRI. So we can get you a full list of all of the breakdown of the rooms, no problem at all, that's all available. But this is going to revolutionise paediatric healthcare. Yes, we'd all greatly prefer it was costing 983 million than the revised, than 450 million more. but this will revolutionise children's healthcare, and we will look back when this hospital opens and we'll wonder, why did we fail to do it? For so long, why had we never done it before? And questions that I get asked at this committee on a very regular basis, and rightly so, about long waiting lists for kids. We will have a serious opportunity to impact them with so much more theatre space, so many more outpatient clinics. And I do need to make this point, because everyone's talking about the new project as though you have to wait for the new shiny buildings to open. Also missing the point. As of today, Children's Health Ireland exists, and our 3 standalone, if we can call them that, children's hospitals have become one entity. And even this year, they're going to start this idea of a centralised referral system. So you used to have a situation whereby if you were a child waiting for an outpatient appointment in Crumlin, you'd wait till Crumlin could see you. Now, actually, if there's a quicker slot in Temple Street, you'll get offered that as well. So we're going to start to see the benefits of these hospitals working together as one entity this year in terms of more outpatient appointments being offered.
Last question, Chairman. Can I ask this question, because it's one that's going to come up again. Public Accounts Committee will deal with this next year or the year after. Mind you, I'm not, I'm at a loss to know what they're dealing with now, because their remit is exclusive of policy. They have no function in policy whatsoever. The question is this: do you now regard the proposal as presented as being good value for money in response to the need to provide a comprehensive hospital system to deal with sick children? Combination of those two issues, those two conflicting issues, is the best value for money. Can we afford to do it or not to do it?
Not to do it. We can't afford not to do it. Not to build this hospital would be a scar on our legacy as an Oireachtas and as a government. Would be yet again neglecting kids who went through the last economic boom, promised a hospital that was never built because we had parish pump politics of trying to fit it into people's constituencies on a site that we could never get planning permission for. We wasted €40 million in taxpayers' money, but even more important than that, we wasted years of kids' lives in terms of not building this hospital. Yes, this is extremely expensive. Yes, it's extremely disappointing, annoying and frustrating that we find ourselves here. Yes, we're going to get the answers, and yes, we're going to continue to do all we can to rein in costs. Absolutely, Deputy, absolutely. We'll hold feet to the coals in relation to that, but we cannot afford not to build this hospital.
Thank you very much, Minister, and thank you very much, Deputy Durkan. Now, Deputy Margaret Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to welcome the Minister, Mr Breslin and Ms Duffy in here this evening, and first of all to congratulate you, Minister, on the birth of your new daughter, and enjoy her day grow up fast, believe me. Minister, yourself and more so the Taoiseach, every time you're questioned about the overspend, you start talking about that the children of this country are worth it and it's going to be state of the art, and I suppose you use up a lot of time talking about the very obvious, and I just want to tell you that I have never heard anyone in this committee suggesting that the children of the country didn't deserve the best. So I would really like if both of you, but particularly the Taoiseach, just wouldn't, every time he's asked about the overspend, spend 2 or 3 minutes saying how great our children are and they deserve the best, because we know that, Minister. You were saying, Minister, there in your unofficial opening statement, I suppose for the want of a better word, that we're comparing apples and oranges, so with regard to a different site, different time, etc. So why then are you so shocked about the overspend, if that's the case? And why didn't you see it coming? And why didn't you say this could happen? That's my first question, Minister, please.
Thanks. So I'm not going to spend 2 or 3 minutes telling you why we did this work. I'm going to spend 10 seconds, because if it was so obvious, why haven't we done it, right? As a country, why have we never done it? Every politician here of all parties have talked about it since 1962, and no one's done it, right? So that's the first point. Sometimes the most obvious things do need to be said. And the other reason I said it, and the other reason I presume the Taoiseach says it, is I have heard proposals in here, well-meaning proposals, and proposals that we've considered too, that if implemented would delay the project. So that's the only reason. In relation to the apples and oranges comment, that was only referencing when people go back and talk about the project from the period of 2012. You're talking about a different site, not you, but one is talking about a different site, a site without planning permission, without tenders. It's ignoring what's happened between 2012 and 19 in terms of the construction environment. So I think it's a very fair conversation to have, and indeed a very serious one to have, as to what happened between April 2017, when the government signed off on this on my recommendation and sanctioned 983 million, and between now, if you like, the end of last year, where the construction cost had risen to 1.4 billion. So that's really the only point I'm making. In relation to how did we not all become aware earlier? How did I not become aware earlier? So I became aware, and I think this is where it shows the governance structure did work. I became aware as soon as all of the various structures became aware that there was a problem. So my department didn't dilly-dally in making me aware at the end of August that there was an emerging issue. But my department also did what I expect government departments, and I think we also did. They did due diligence, and they made sure that the expert reports were there so that they could provide me with the best possible advice when I went to government. And I do need to say, Deputy Murphy-O'Mahony, because I don't want you to think that this was an easy decision. This was touch and go. I mean, this was such a large sum of money, but the other options didn't bear thinking about, because it was pause, and God knows where that would have brought us. It was retender, which would have ended up costing us more. Various variations, which I think the Secretary-General explained well in terms of scoping, that would have actually given us an inferior hospital at a further date and time, possibly for more money. So I'm very committed, I know you are, to building this project. I didn't see another way of proceeding, but that's not to say, now that we know about the cost at this relatively early stage through the GMP process, that's not to say that we shouldn't be looking at every opportunity now to rein back the costs.
Okay, thanks, Minister. Minister, do you think that Sloan to Care will be affected by the overspend? And also, who or when will it be decided what projects will be delayed directly as a result of the overspend?
You're probably thinking about Bantry as well,
yes,
because I know we always talk about Bantry.
I'll slip that in.
Just trying to help you, but not that you need it. In relation to Sláinte Care, so there's two sides to Sláinte Care. A large part of Sláinte Care is going to be current expenditure, things like looking at the eligibility framework, reducing the drug payment scheme, prescription charges, GP contract, things the Chair is very interested in, all of which are very much in the current expenditure space. That's not obviously impacted by this. There is a degree of Sláinte Care that's capital of an important part. There's the elective hospitals, one in Dublin, one in Cork, one in Limerick. There's obviously the bed capacity. So I'll be prioritising the measures that will deliver Sláinte Care and that would increase capacity. Yes, we do need to find this money from across the capital budget, that's true, but we do need to see it in a context. I think, I'm open to correction, but I think this year the state will spend about 7 billion on capital projects. I'm open to correction. My department will spend nearly 600 million. My department has to find 50, and the rest of the government has to find 50. So yes, we'd rather not have to find it, but it does need to be seen in the context of a massively increased capital budget for both health and the rest of government.
So Bantry plans are okay?
I was delighted to visit it with you and Minister Daly, and obviously we made a number of announcements that day that are underway. It's a very good hospital. We'll stick to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
President, do you want to add anything to those questions?
No. I have another. Yeah, just brief. I have time, haven't I? Yeah.
You have, yes. Yeah.
Minister, the 450,000 cost for the review. Do you think this is value for money? Are you happy enough to stand over it? And I'm glad you said at the start there that the findings would be made public, because it was reported over the weekend that they wouldn't. And was it ever the case that you said, or your department said, that it wouldn't be made public, the findings?
No, not that I'm aware of at all. I mean, this report has to be made public. I want to see it, but I also taxpayers' money. It will inform my decision-making process. I'm sure it'll inform the work of this committee, and we need to show the public why we're making the various decisions we'll have to make in the time ahead. So no, it was always my intention to make it public. I'll bring it to government, publish it here, afford people briefings or whatever people of this committee want, Chairman, through your own work. In relation to the cost, I must admit the cost seems quite large to me. I didn't have a role in the cost. This is a report commissioned. This is a report commissioned by the HSE. I believe they're drawing off a procurement framework. It is important that we have senior people do this body of work. I think that's true. I did hear the figure of 450 said at this committee. I think that's at the upper end. I think the range is 360 to 450, and I think it's based on a daily rate payable to the company. So it's a fixed figure decided by a framework contract, as opposed to a sum of money arrived at by me.
Okay, and do you think it will be definitely the middle of March before the findings will be?
Yeah, my understanding is the report's due back back in the month of March, and we won't wait around in terms of making sure we bring that report to government swiftly and publish it swiftly and send it to this committee swiftly.
Okay, and you're obviously willing to learn from lessons.
It's absolutely essential we learn, and I would suggest that the learning will go well beyond just this project. I'd imagine there'll be learning
across the board
for capital
thanks,
projects.
Minister.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Murphy. We're now going to move to Deputy O'Connell, Deputy Mullen, and then our non-members. Sorry, we have to take members first. And then Senator Mary Louise O'Donnell and Deputy John Brazel. So, Deputy O'Connell.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister, for coming in to us, and Mr. Breslin and Ms. Duffy. Just from the outset, just to support you, Minister, in your assertion of the need for this hospital. I think anyone that calls for a halt to this project at this point hasn't been to one of our paediatric hospitals in the last few decades. Just for the sake of the committee, it's all fine turning up with your child with a broken arm in A&E, but to go down the corridor to get a cup of tea and to meet children with drip stands, having chemo and masks, where you have access to every sort of bacteria, bits of plaster missing off walls, absolute neglect of our children, to my mind. So for anybody that thinks this should be stopped right now, I would urge them, perhaps of a Friday night or a Saturday night, to tip out to Crumlin, and maybe a Saturday, maybe in Temple Street might be a good place to visit as well. I suppose, from my point of view, I come to this again as somebody who very much bought into the whole project, studied it, didn't buy into it's the wrong site, it's the wrong site. And there are some people, I'm sure, today that will still talk about greenfield sites. But I very much bought into the project, the need for parental accommodation, the need for valet parking, and the need for all of the modern things that a modern hospital needs. That's why I was so disappointed when this all came out, because I had been one of the people that have spoken about it publicly over the years, as somebody who has reason to use the hospital quite a lot, more for clavicles than, thank God, chemotherapy. So that's what's so difficult about this. And we sat here in October 2017, and Professor Hardiman had a model of the hospital. And what annoys me today, what concerns me today, was in that beautiful model we saw with the rooftop garden, what was under it? Had no one ever thought about the design element until stage A was in the ground. To me, it's almost as though someone was looking on Pinterest for a couple of years, chatting about what sort of hospital you might like if you ever got the chance to build one. But in terms of somebody sitting down, making decisions about what the walls are made out of, how many rooms, that doesn't seem, to my mind, from what evidence we've been given, to have been started until 2017. Again, just some of the comparisons that are being made, comparing the increase in bed numbers. I totally agree with you, Minister, this is apples and oranges. Comparing it to other hospitals, you're looking at completely different tax regimes, different sizes of rooms. So for people that are out there throwing these accusations, these international comparisons and data out there that really are of absolutely no relevance to the current issue. I was asked the other day why this happened, and I said because it can happen, was the answer. And I said it here last week, and Deputy Kelly spoke about it earlier, about the board structure and the National Paediatric Hospital Development Board that was appointed by yourself, Minister, in 2009. And somehow along the way, and I spoke about this last week, in May 2017, there was a change in governance structure where this new board and steering group was set up. Now, I can understand why that happened if the first guys were looking at Pinterest. I can understand why you to set up people who actually make decisions and do things. But, Minister, you appointed that board, and I'm asking you here today, you reappointed the board, and you are now the minister. Do you think, and we were told last week or the week before that this was a competency-based board membership, do you think the people that were appointed to that board day one were competent, or if we'd like to put a more political slant on it, do you think they had the requisite skill set to do the job? And do you now think that perhaps reappointing them was a mistake, and you think we need to look at that in the short term? Because
can you put those questions?
no, I'm still at 5. I'm grand.
No, but
I've only asked one question.
we need to get a reply.
I've only asked one question. Sorry, Chair. Now, I'll leave myself time. I'm watching it here.
No, but we have to give
Okay,
the
go ahead,
Minister an
Minister.
opportunity
Go
to
ahead.
reply within your time frame.
I get that. Yes,
reply.
briefly, if you might, Minister.
So the first question. The reason the structure was put in place in 2017 in terms of a steering group structure was we have 3 different elements going on here. We have the integration of our 3 hospitals and the legislation and bringing together, which was a major, major body of work, taking 3 voluntary hospitals and putting them into 1 statutory hospital. Many people thought it would never happen. It did happen, right? So that was a huge body of work that consumed a lot of my time and indeed yours in the Oireachtas. Second was the operationalised, setting up Children's Health Ireland, actually running the Children's Health Service. And the third was the building, the actual building project. So the idea was to have a group, a steering group, looking at those 3 elements, and that was the answer. In relation to your question specifically about the board, 2 answers to that. Are they a competency-based board? It's very hard to define them as anything else. When you look at their CVs, their qualifications, their professional experience, this is not about tapping random people on the street on the shoulder.
But Minister,
so that's the first point I'd make. The second point, though, I would make is, and I made this very clear when I reappointed the board in 2017, and I reappointed them for continuity because the project was underway. In my letters to each of them, I pointed out that the Oireachtas would shortly be passing legislation, and that legislation would give me the power to appoint a different board should I choose to do so, and that's the power that I have today, and it's one that I'll be reflecting on.
And was that a little bit of a stick, Minister? Was that a little nudge to them to go get your act together?
No, it wasn't. It was a reminder to them that factually the Oireachtas was about to give me new power to reappoint or appoint a different board, and I have that power today thanks to these houses of the Oireachtas. So the people on that board were reappointed to a term of 2023, but they were reappointed in the knowledge that the new legislation would trump that, and I now have to consider those matters when I get the PwC report.
And would you consider now that this new board and steering group has been appointed in May 2017 that the first crowd are essentially, are they defunct or have they a role still?
And I asked the Secretary-General to give his perspective in relation to that, but my perspective is that the structures put in place were done for the reasons that I outlined in terms of coordinating those 3 distinct...
And if I may, because I've asked my final question, of the plus 450, the overrun, what percentage of that is fees for, as in not product, fees, architect fees, consultant fees, external advisor fees? So what percentage of the overrun if we're comparing 983 and 1.4? If I could have that figure. I understand, Mr. President, if you don't have that to hand. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. President.
So perhaps the use of the word board is confusing, and in retrospect it mightn't have been the one we should have used. It's very important to understand that the Development Board, which is the statutory body that has been asked to procure, to design, to build, to furnish and to equip the hospital, has stayed throughout this process. It has a competency-based board, it has expertise within it, property professionals and construction professionals within it on its staff, and it has a design team appointed which includes some of the largest firms nationally or internationally that have the expertise to undertake that essentially professional task of developing a design, procuring against it and implementing it. To the question that you asked, so the important thing is structures above that are not about designing the hospital. They're not about procuring the hospital. They're about 2 separate things. One is that they oversee how the board is delivering on it against its budget. The second, which is just as important, is that on the day the hospital opens, a number of things have to converge. The hospital has to have been built and equipped, which is where we are now, but importantly, other things have to happen. So we've created Children's Health Ireland to bring together the 3 constituent hospitals so that those services move over into the hospital in a seamless fashion. And the third thing is we have to have an electronic health record and an ICT capacity delivered into the hospital. The first, the build of the hospital, is the Development Board's job. The second, the move over of the services, is Children's Health Ireland. And the third, the development of an electronic health record, which will be the electronic health record for the rest of the Irish hospital system, is the HSE's responsibility. And so a really important function, and part of the reason why in 2017 those new structures were brought into place, was to make sure that all of those things happen in the proper order and they complete on the right timescale. So there's an element of the governance which is about integrating different work streams, only one of which is building the hospital. The other point that you've asked is around the design team. The design team, I'm told, in the figures that we have supplied to you today, the estimate, but obviously it's a budget and an estimate, the estimate of the increase, the proportion of the 450 million that is towards the design team, is shown at number 6 in the table on page 3. The total cost being 53. Of that, 28 million is design team cost.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank
President.
you, Mr. President.
Deputy O'Connell, can I move on to our
Yeah.
next deputy?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So, Senator Mullen.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. Minister, I must say I am very disappointed by the fact that the Secretary-General of the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform refused to come before this committee. And I think it's bizarre that the head of a department overseeing public expenditure wouldn't see it as their role to be accountable in some way for colossal cost overruns for the largest health service capital project. And I'd be grateful for your opinion as to whether my disappointment is justified.
So it's my view is very clear that the accounting officer for this project under law, and the accounting officer for the health vote is my Secretary General, Mr. Breslin, who's obviously sitting to my left. I think that was the point Robert Watt made to the committee. It's a matter for the committee as to how it pursues that. But I understand that Secretary General Watt is, of course, accountable to committees of this House, including the Budgetary Oversight Committee, which I'd imagine will have questions in relation to budgets. I think there may be a committee of that very shortly, and I know that the Secretary General also attends the meetings of the PAC. So really, I'm not going to get into internal Secretary General, who does what. But I'm very clear that from a governance point of view and a legal point of view, the appropriate Secretary General is here today.
Just to say, I'm very clear that the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform has appointed me as accounting officer for the health vote. I take that responsibility very seriously. I take this committee very seriously, and I am accountable and happy to sit here and be accountable.
Well, we're very happy to have you here, Mr. Breslin, but it's a separate question. I think that really, given the catastrophic projected cost overruns here, I think government officials should be erring on the side of helpfulness, and if a letter comes from this committee, that's something that should have been taken seriously. Minister, your essential defence to all of this is that we're so far in now that it would be unthinkable, unconscionable to go back, to have delays, to go reviewing, to go retendering and so on, which is essentially the Macbeth defence. I am in blood steeped in so far that should I wade no more, to go back would be as tedious to go o'er. But that may be true. That or otherwise, others more knowledgeable about finances perhaps than some people that have been dealing with this can give it perhaps a helpful assessment on that. But it's a separate question whether the initial decision making around this project are the reason why we're here now. And I would like to ask you, do you deny categorically, as I think I heard you do, that the complexity of developing, the relative complexity at the St. James's site is linked with the projected cost overruns? I mean, do you deny that? Because I think a lot of people won't believe you if you do.
Well, I don't deny anything because I'm not the art of let him deny it. But what I know is that 983 million was the projected cost of delivering the hospital on the St. James's site. So we are comparing the projected cost of the St. James's site in 2017 with the projected cost of delivering the project now on the St James's site. So we're not comparing it with the cost of delivering on any other site. The cost overrun doesn't relate to a difference between one site or the other. So yes, I do not believe that is the contributory factor in relation to the overrun, but not only do I not believe it, the evidence doesn't believe it, because 983 million was the cost of the James's site. The difference of 450 million still relates to that
Isn't it precisely because of the complexity of the St James's site that people weren't able to cost it properly, as now emerges?
Well,
Do you deny that?
It's not that I deny it. I've yet to see a report or an expert opinion that suggests that to be the case.
I would say, well, I would have thought it's pretty evident to most people. I mean, perhaps that's why the
well, where's the evidence, Senator Mullen? If it's pretty evident, that being a variation of the word evidence, where's the evidence?
The point is, well, let's put it
Where's
this way.
the report?
When we do get to the... You seem to be in love with reports, but from the taxpayer's point of view...
No, I'm in love with evidence.
Something scandalous has gone on here. And you, as a member of Cabinet, received a detailed dossier from, for example, the Connolly for Kids project, as did other members of Cabinet. You were given detailed submissions as to why there were relative problems with this site, and they still point out, for example, that you can't, we don't have co-location with a maternity hospital, there's parking issues, it's impossible to land the largest ARC rescue. You've heard and you know of and are familiar with the criticisms. And those criticisms don't come from politicians trying to score points. They come from medical experts, including one person with an experience of building several hospitals who can't be said to have a vested interest in this. And I think what Dr. Sheehan, who I'm referring to, and others have saying, really amounts to an indictment of the political class. We can ask hard questions of hapless officials all we like about how did this happen and where is it going to go from here and where precisely did it go wrong. But in reality, isn't it the case that the political class made the wrong decision and were wedded to the wrong decision right from the start, and that is connected with these projected cost overruns?
No, it's not. So firstly, I don't question the bona fides of those people. I have no intention of getting into any sort of conversation that would suggest they're bona fides. People had a view. Some people had a view it should be built on the Connolly site. Some people, including the former Taoiseach, had a view it should be built on the Mater site. Some people had a view it should be built on a Greenfield site. Some people had a view it should be built on the St James's site. And politics is about making decisions. And I stand over the decision to build it on the St James's site. I stand over it safe in the knowledge that it is a decision supported by the current practicing paediatricians in many of our children's hospitals. That there's many doctors who support it, but as you and I know from lots of different issues, different doctors have different views on matters, different builders have different views on matters. The government's made a decision. None of those issues though that you relate that. None of those issues in relation to should it have been a Connolly site or a James's site relate to the cost overrun. For example, if you look at the briefing document that my Secretary General has provided to the committee, those costs don't relate to costs that incurred at the St James's site that wouldn't have incurred at a different site. So I genuinely, truthfully, Senator Mullen, don't believe that to be the case. I don't doubt the bona fides of people who would have liked it to be at an alternative site, but I really think we've had that debate. We've had it for many, not just in relation to Connolly, we had it before with the Mater, and all the time a hospital wasn't being built. Obviously, there will be a development at Connolly that will open this summer and start serving children as part of Children's Health Ireland.
Just last question then, Minister. I mentioned the political class because I don't think it's fair to blame any one political party for this, but we had mismanagement when Fianna Fáil were in the past, where you had massive overruns, evading accountability for the same reasons that you're now giving today. I'm thinking the Port Tunnel, various motorway projects and so on. But can you give two questions. Can you give an express commitment that once the cause of this has been found, that the person or peoples directly responsible or ultimately responsible will be asked to resign? That's my first question. And the second thing is, do you think that the eventual cost will go over $2 billion?
So in relation to your first question, I'll take the appropriate action in terms of who are the appropriate people to oversee this project when I get the PwC report. I didn't come here today to kind of create headlines in terms of how I'll react when I get the report, because I'll get it, I'll read it, I'll publish it, and I'll take very swift action in terms of what changes, if any, I believe are needed at that time. In relation to the complete cost of the project, again, I'll be informed by the PwC report and the various work that's ongoing. But the board has received a very clear message from me, which is delivered on behalf of the government, that we are well past the outer limits of what we can be managing as a country to be spending on this hospital.
That doesn't sound like a guarantee that it's not going to go over $2 billion.
Because I think in fairness, Senator Mullen, if we're going to commission external reports, if we're going to follow the evidence, That's what we're going to do, and we'll come back and we'll share all of that information here. I do believe, and I did outline in my earlier answers, I think to Deputy Donnelly, that there are opportunities to try and, in some ways, mitigate costs. So I have talked about the existing assets that are already in place, Crumlin being one. I've also talked about the role of philanthropy, which is nothing Irish specific in that. Philanthropy in terms of the delivery of children's healthcare is quite the norm in many countries, including our neighbouring jurisdiction, and there obviously has been a foundation set up. So I think on both sides of that ledger, there are issues that need to be bottomed out.
Thank you very much, Minister, and thank you very much, Senator Mullen. I'm now going to move on to Senator Mary Louise O'Donnell for 5 minutes, forwards and back, and Deputy Brazel, 5 minutes, forward and back. And we might just have a quick fire second round, Minister.
Any fire? Yep.
Hopefully not.
Thank you very much, and thank
Senator.
you, Chair, for giving me the time. And I'm not on this committee, and I bow to the better judgment and the knowledge and experience and reading of my colleagues on this committee. I just want to make an observation. I think there's this huge anger out in the public, and we all know it. But from a very objective point of view, it seems to me, the anger in the public is also about the fact that we have nurses who can't live in our country. They're underpaid. There's not enough of them. We have doctors leaving. We have not enough radiographers or occupational therapists. We have 162 consultant posts not filled, and we have people acting as consultants who haven't done specialist registrar training. And we have we are an overrun of 1.7 billion on a hospital. Now, you might think they're not mutually exclusive, but I think they are very connected. So there's something rotten in the state here. There's something going radically wrong here. The question I would like to ask is this, and it's very simple to your accounting officer, to Mr. Jim Breslin. Is the design team on a flat fee, or is it on a percentage of the cost? Is the mechanical and electrical consultant engineers on a flat fee or on a percentage of the cost? If I look at the mechanical Jones group, they're up by 65.4%, and the electrical are up by 60.2%. So could you answer that? Are they on a flat fee or a percentage of the cost? The second thing is, and it was alluded to by Deputy O'Reilly, tell me just about PwC and the objectivity of them. Were they involved, or have they been involved in any other aspect of the hospitals since the first sod was turned, before, middle or after? I know they're doing the investigation for you now. So they're the two questions.
Mr. President.
So at the meeting last week, Mr. Pollock was here, who's
So you'll forgive me if I'm asking, if I'm repeating.
And he did, and he went quite a way through a number of those questions. So I'm basing, partly repeating what he said in relation to the design team. He was able to say that they're not on a percentage of the overall build cost. They are on an overall fee, but he, I think, flagged at the committee that because the project is going on for a longer time period, the cost of their services are going to increase.
I don't, sorry, Mr. President, I don't understand your answer there. Are they on a flat fee, or are they on a percentage of the cost, and not a flat fee getting a little drumland halfway down the road? So, what are they on? So
my answer to a percentage of the cost is they're not on a percentage of the cost.
They're not. What are they on a percentage of then? Because I get the impression
they're
they're on
not
something.
on a percentage.
Okay.
Now, if you let me answer the flat fee question. They've tendered a fee for the job, but contractually they will have an opportunity to come back in and say that the length of time on the job has significantly extended and that they should be compensated for that. And I'm quoting from, in essence, what Mr. Pollock said last week.
That is possibly the most nebulous thing I've heard for a long time, but that's fine. Is that the same for the mechanical, the electrical and engineering?
No, and again, there was a lot of discussion at this.
I know that.
They are the contractors. There are three contractors on the job. There's BAM, there's Mercury, and there's Jones. And the mechanical and electrical, they tendered the rates for the pieces that they would supply. The process of finalising the design has now finalised the quantities that will be in the job, and as a result of that, their overall costs have gone up.
I bet they have. So I'm right. There's something very amiss there. But we will come. I'm sure that'll be worked out.
It's not news to say that there's something very amiss in the escalation between the preliminary design and the final design, and it's definitely not news, and we've tried to set it out in the briefing note that a very, very sizable factor in that is the mechanical and electrical works.
Oh, yes. And just my PwC, sorry, Chair, thank you, the PwC, the objectivity of the PwC and whether they were involved in any aspect of this before coming in now as the Great White Hope.
So there was a specific question about PwC having played a role, Deputy O'Reilly asked it early on, playing a role vis-à-vis BAM, who are a contractor. Our understanding at the moment is that's not the case, but we are definitively establishing that. In respect of the Development Board, PwC have not played a role with them on this at any stage in the process?
Ever.
Ever.
Thank you, Mr. Breslin. Now, Deputy John Brazel.
Thank you, Chairman.
5 minutes.
Minister, I'd also like to congratulate you on your recent good news and wish you every good fortune. Minister, I don't want to be repetitive, but I would just ask you to look at the reasoning behind the two-stage process that's outlined. And when you look at what it was supposed to achieve versus what it actually turned out as, I think it's contradictory to say the least, and therefore I would very much question the board's reasoning, particularly when it came to deciding that the best option for phase 2 was to award it to the phase 1 contractor. I would ask you to, and did anybody, specifically ask you, did anybody flag to you that the 631 million price for the phase 1 of the job was 131 million, 20% lower than the next bid? Because as I pointed out here last Wednesday, to be 20% lower in any construction bid would ring alarm bells at any level, and why it didn't with the board, I find it very difficult to understand. Some of the figures that were given, 90 million for a 9-month extension of contract, including prelims. I would ask you to investigate that thoroughly, because I cannot see how 90 million can be justified for increased prelims for 9 months. 27 million for increased spend as a result of fire regs, as I pointed out last week. 27 million would build you a 90,000 square foot state-of-the-art office block. That's just to put it into context. But Minister, the central question that I want to ask you today is, you were made aware in late August that there was significant increase in costs. On November the 7th, the board recommended BAM to be the second phase contractor. Were you consulted on the decision to appoint BAM for this part of the work? And then in December 18th, the government signed off on it. So why were PwC not brought in August, when significant increased costs were flagged, to review a potential overrun of 400 million? And then that was subsequently approved, because what we're doing now is, it's a case of closing the barn door after the horse is bolted. That review should have been carried out prior to the second phase being awarded and prior to landing us in a situation where we're at the point of no return. You can't go back, you have to go forward. And as I pointed out here last week, the nature of the contractor is to get the work and then maximise the money they can get from it. It has happened consistently on public contracts for years, and this particular contract, because of the way it was structured, allowed for an absolute golden opportunity, which they took.
Brazel, Minister,
very much, and thank you, Deputy Brazel. So a couple of questions there. So in relation to the GMP, I think it is important to say that, this was a strategy, I think, agreed back as far as 2014. The Government Contracts Committee for Construction did also consider it. In the Mazars report, which is even, which there's no doubt about it, does find significant shortcomings in terms of lack of early warning and the likes, it does still arrive at the conclusion that it was the right procurement model to use for a project of such complexity. I don't have the expertise that they have in terms of arriving at that conclusion. You asked, was I aware that that the main contractor had come in significantly beloo the previous one? I don't believe so from recollection, but I also, as you know, as the government makes the decision to award, I don't interfere in the procurement process, where I'd be answering much more difficult questions here in that regard. Why was PwC commissioned after the awarding of Phase B is a valid question. I do think it's important when we look at the timeline that on the 5th of September, when the National Paediatric Hospital Development Board was briefed by the design team on overall capital costs, the board then sought and subsequently obtained a 3-month window to conclude the GMP negotiations without incurring additional costs. So they were up against a clock in terms of not incurring additional costs above and beyond the already agreed pricing as well. But there were reviews done, in fairness to them. The Mazars report, the DSSR, in terms of an international consultancy firm, to see if there were opportunities to de-scope or to descale some of the issues. You also asked the question, was I consulted in relation to the decision to award BAM? Absolutely, it was a government decision. So, I brought that proposal to the government on the 18th of December, and the decision to award that instruction was only relayed by the appropriate authorities in January after the government decision was given. So ultimately, it was a government decision on the 18th of December to proceed with the awarding of Phase B.
Thank you very much, Minister. And one last question.
Yeah, I would just contend, Minister, that awarding that contract, having not carried out the review, was, in my opinion, a sizable error. And the threat of further increased costs, given that you're dealing with a 400 million overrun, I would say, on the balance of reason, that carrying out the review prior to awarding, particularly with the figures that I've just pointed out, 2 of them, there's 5 or 6 of significance that I would have serious questions over how they can be justified. I think that was a serious error on government's behalf, and I think it's something that is going to continue to rumble over the unfortunate. It is a very much needed project, which I support thoroughly, sure. But unfortunately the concentration on the project is now going to be on this particular issue, not on the delivery of the much needed hospital.
Yeah, and I hope it's not entirely on the delivery of that issue, on the cost issue, though I understand that obviously is going to be an ongoing issue, but I do hope the clinical benefits, which you understand more than most and are very supportive of, will also be an issue which this committee will monitor closely. I do just need to say, in closing on that question, I don't want you to get the impression that the government arrived at, or indeed that the department advised me, that we go ahead and proceed with Phase B in the absence of expert advice, and there was a significant amount of what I'd call due diligence done between August and the 18th of December, and also engagement of the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform before proceeding with that. And as I'd outlined earlier at the meeting, the options of retendering, pausing or proceeding were ultimately the 3 considered, and the decision to proceed was the one recommended to me, which I accepted.
Minister, thank you very much. Before I go back to our members, can I ask you, Minister, in the opening statement of the Department of Health last week,
yes.
The government made 3 decisions in relation to the cost overrun. Mm-hmm. One was to commission an independent review by PricewaterhouseCoopers, which
yes.
is underway. The second was a review of the existing oversight arrangements between the Department of Health, the HSE and the board, the Development Board, which I don't think has started yet. And the third decision was a scenario analysis to identify potential costs of any residual risks to the capital project. So does that mean that there is an anticipation that the cost is going to go above the 1.733 billion? Are you anticipating that in that decision?
Sure. So just on your first question, Chairman, so the second review, as you talk about the governance, what I've decided to do in the interest of both time and the taxpayer is be led by the outcome of the PwC review, which will obviously highlight where the problems were and the shortcomings. Then I'll decide on the new governance structures as appropriate. So I think that's the sequence in which I've decided to take it. In relation to the expectation of future costs.
Yes, the exclusions are on page 1 of the briefing note for today. It identifies where the exclusions outside of the guaranteed maximum price are, and they're specifically listed in the contract as not being incorporated in the guaranteed maximum price, and they're listed down there, which is changes in scope if the development board decided to build something differently, excess national construction inflation above 4% from July of this year, changes in legislation. And what's been asked by government is that we perform a sensitivity analysis. So what could happen to the overall price if there were movements in any of those exclusions?
So does that mean that the eventual cost is going to exceed 1.733?
Well, it depends on, say, legislation, if there were new changes in VAT rate and so on. The one that's perhaps most difficult to control is the construction inflation. It's 4% from July provided for in the contract, and at the moment construction inflation is significantly in excess of that.
So those exclusions are on top of the 1.733?
Well, I would say the 1.4, Chair. But
okay, on the 1.433. Thank you very much. Now, in the interest of time, we're going to have 5 minutes for our second round, if that's okay. So, Deputy Donnelly.
Thanks, Chair. Minister, Mr. President, I have to say I was hoping for something else today. We've heard from the board, we've heard from the department, we've heard from the HSE. I've asked them all whether or not they believed that what has happened is a catastrophic failure of management. All of them have said no. They've said they would do things exactly the same. They've said they don't consider the financial side of this to be a failure. And whilst I acknowledge the Minister has referenced being deeply frustrated, I haven't heard an admission that this is a gargantuan cock-up of epic proportions with massive negative knock-on effects on the healthcare system. I think the Irish people have been had. I think we've just been mugged to the tune of about €1 billion. Your own documentation says the tender bid accepted was 637 million. That went up to 890 million. That went up to 983 million. That went up to 1.4 billion. And by the way, there's an additional 300 million on top of that. You can come back in when I'm done. Thank you, Mr. Breslin. In the commercial world, any project manager who presented that to the ultimate client would be fired on the spot, and their company would be dismissed on the spot. But nothing of the sort has happened here. Not a single sanction of any kind has been taken against anybody. But it gets worse, because what we've heard today was that whilst it was clearly possible for the project cost to go up by €1 billion, it's impossible to bring it down. And Mr. Breslin, you said, you can't really bring the 1.7 billion down or the 1.4 billion down because, for example, the external fabric of the building might have to change, thereby leading to new planning. But isn't it interesting that when the €1 billion was being added in, the external fabric of the building clearly didn't have to change because new planning wasn't required. The only real defence I've heard is the hospital is really important and it's going to be of a really high spec. It is really important and it is going to be of a high spec. I agree with both of those things. The most expensive hospital ever built anywhere in the world is the Karolinska University Hospital. It's built in Stockholm, which is an incredibly expensive city. And it is built to an incredibly high spec, and it has oodles of operating theatres and MRI machines and single occupancy rooms and all of those things. And it cost 1.6 million per bed. And it's super high spec. Yeah, Chair, no, I understand. It is super high spec. Now, at 1.6 million per bed, the National Children's Hospital, building at the same cost as the most expensive hospital ever built, which is super high spec, would be 750 million. So you can triangulate the costs in all sorts of ways, and you keep getting back to a figure of about €1 billion. Now, my questions are, the PwC report, the department found out about this in August. PwC aren't going to report till March. Do you think a 7-month time period from finding out about this to getting to the report is reasonable? When was the PwC report commissioned? Is there not a Mazars report that was commissioned previously? And how is the PwC report different to that? Can the committee have the Mazars report? When did the Mazars report come to the department? Is the Department of Health not capable of finding out what went wrong? Certainly this committee has some pretty reasonable ideas about what went wrong. The final question I have is, I want to go back to the PwC report, and Minister, I'm happy to stand corrected, but I believe you stated that PwC will be looking at ways to reduce the 1.7 billion or 1.4 billion. My understanding is that that is not in the terms of reference. My understanding is that PwC is an accountancy firm. The value engineering and redesign and technical appraisals needed to look at reverse engineering out some of those costs require engineers and architects and specialists. Can I ask you to confirm whether or not there is a substantive effort being made to look at redesigning some of these massive cost overruns out of the hospital so that cost can be deployed in other areas? Thank you.
Minister, thank
so
you.
what you haven't heard from me today, Deputy Donnelly, which you suggest you've heard from others, is that everything should be done exactly the same as it was. I'm not in a position to say that to this committee. I'm not saying it to this committee. What I'm saying is I'm going to follow the evidence in terms of what could be done better. It's not. I don't think you're quite suggesting this, but it's not true that nothing happened between August and December, or indeed August and now. There were a number of reports done. Yes, they should be. I believe a number of them have been, but if they all haven't, they should be shared with this committee, and I'll make sure that happens, because they do make points that quite frankly and respectfully are different to your point. So I hear the reference you make to the hospital in Stockholm quite regularly. We obviously had ACOM undertake an international cost benchmarking study where they arrive at a different viewpoint to you. They arrive at the point that this hospital will come in at a cost of about 6,500 per square metre, whereas a equivalent hospital to be built in London, for example, would come in at €9,000 per square metre. They also say that it comes in within the range for similar projects, albeit at the upper end of that range. So I'm happy to share all that information. So there was a lot of expert opinions sought before we decided to proceed with the project to, I suppose, endeavour to debunk some of those concerns that people may have. Yes, there is a serious and ongoing effort to make sure costs can be reined in without doing what none of us want to do, and I accept no one wants to do, which is without impacting on the integrity of the project. What we don't want to do is end up building a really expensive hospital and taking out some stuff that would have actually benefited paediatric healthcare. And that's the balance we've got to get right here. We're obviously contracted at 1.4 billion in terms of our capital construction costs as well. Can I ask? Do you want to? Did you wish to add something?
Well, just on the figures, because because there are so many figures, it can be confusing. We've tried in page 2 and page 3 of the briefing note to try and capture the figures. It's important to say that the 637 million, which is the cost of the 3 contractors, Mercury and Jones, which is shown in table 3, that 637 is the tender. That is in the 983 million that went to government and was signed off. So it's not that it went from 637 to 983. It's in there, but there are other things in there. There is equipping in there, there's VAT in there, and so on. The real shift over the procurement process is from 983 to 1.4. I know the point is made, previous iterations that the project had other costs, but that's the real shift in the procurement stage. And I have not try to lessen the importance, the gravity of that. I absolutely agree with you, the seriousness of that. In terms of learning and in terms that we need to do differently, we absolutely need to do things differently. If I heard one thing, I thought what I heard from the witnesses the last day was that they would still use the approach, the 2-stage approach. I don't believe anybody would say all of the actions are appropriate and that there weren't things that couldn't have been done to try and manage this better. We are absolutely have to go after that to the fullest extent. I would already have some indications of that myself, but I want to see what PwC say, and we will fully implement that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Breslin. Now, and Deputy Donnelly, thank you very much. Deputy O'Reilly.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you again for being here and for allowing us the opportunity to question you for another round. The PwC, the appointment of PwC, and I know this, I had referred to it and didn't get an opportunity to answer. It's a very simple one. I'm not interested in how bedded in they are or how intertwined with this whole process they are. Are they the on-site compliance managers for BAM?
So I did answer it in a subsequent question. The information that we've got currently is that's not the case, but I don't want to be definitive until
see, here's my problem, because, you know, we're looking at very, very senior people, government minister and the head of a department, and you're telling me something that I believe is very fundamental, because a company that potentially has a vested interest possibly aren't the best people to do the review.
No, I
but
don't,
you can't say.
Yeah, but even in that case, I don't see it. The people who are doing this have senior procurement, healthcare, project management expertise. They are not the people who are working with BAM. And I have no basis to believe that there are people from PwC with BAM. But even if there were, the team that's been brought in here, a highly expert team, they involve people from London.
I'm making a different point, Mr. Breslin, in that this is something that you should know and be able to say with confidence one way or another. Either they are, I've reviewed it and I'm happy, or they absolutely aren't. And you can't answer that question.
I've given you my current understanding.
And I appreciate that. What I'm saying to you is that really what I would have hoped for was some class of an answer, not your best understanding or your best guess, an actual answer. Because I believe...
I will be held to my answer, so it's important that I give you my current understanding, and just to say to you, if there is any issue with that, I will be back to you immediately to clarify it.
Mr. Breslin, what I'm saying to you is it would have been preferable if you had had that answer here, that an issue like that would have been important enough that you would have checked it before you came here. You didn't, you will check it and you will come back to us, and that's fine. But what I am saying is, if I were in your position, I believe that that is something that would be important to me, and it would be something that I would have a definitive answer on.
So
it's a question that it would be very easy to anticipate, given that there has been a lot of public commentary, and the Minister referred to public commentary made. There has been a lot of public commentary about the fact that nearly €500,000 has been spent on this report. So it's something that I believe you should have had. You don't have the answer, but you will get the answer, and that's fine. We will await the answer.
And you let me just come back on that then. Thank you. I wasn't party to the procurement of PwC. Had I been a party to that, that would be something that you would check in the procurement process. So that is an issue that will have been checked in the procurement process, but I wasn't the person doing the procurement.
Okay. And again, I say it would have been preferable if you had the answer, but you don't. Can I ask, with regard to the person on the board from the office, and I'm wary about naming people, right? And I don't think it's always fair to do that, but the person on the board who was from the Office of Government Procurement, from the Department of Finance, at any stage, was there a meeting held between officials from the Department of Health, preferably the Minister, but this person who I would see as being almost the government representative on the board, certainly the person who was there to oversee procurement, because that's the office that this person comes from, was there at any stage, or how many meetings were there between department officials and this individual? Because, you know, while much has been made out of the two-step procurement process, and I know everyone has said, let's not talk about building houses like that, but I most definitely would not build a house like that, and I don't think anyone in this room would either. Or indeed a more complex project. I think if they had their time over, maybe they wouldn't go for that. But this person presumably was appointed to oversee some of the procurement. I mean, it's a competency-based board, so that person, well, from what I can gather from reading the man's bio, the competency he has is in the area of public procurement. So in a competency-based board, that's the competency that he brings. And I'm just wondering, did he report back to you? Did he ensure that you were kept abreast? Did he ensure that you were well informed? Was this done verbally? Was it done via meetings? Was it done in reports? How was that communicated? Because we keep coming back to the same issue, which is that it does seem that there was something of a hands-off approach adopted, and the end result of that is, and there's all sorts of words being used, but let's go with catastrophic for the moment, catastrophic overrun, or whatever words you want to put on it. And I have just two more questions, and I'll ask them together, and then perhaps you can answer. The financial statements for 2018, I know the financial statements for 2017 have been sent to the Public Accounts Committee. Are they available currently? If not, when will they be available, and can they be circulated to the members of this committee as well? I know they're not required for the first...
Yeah, it would normally be the end of March before you would finalise an audit.
That's fine. But they will be obviously published.
The Controller and Auditor General.
I know, I understand that, but I'm asking if the statements are ready. My last question is one that I had asked the Minister. We didn't get a chance to come back to it. the head of the board was very clear in saying that important lessons indeed, had been learned. And he wasn't as effusive in his detail on what those lessons were. But, Minister, have you learned lessons from this process? And if you have, what are those lessons, and how can we be sure that this is not going to just keep spiralling out of control as we sit here? Thanks.
Deputy O'Reilly, thank you very much. Minister.
I think the Deputy had roughly three questions for me. Just the said individual that you're referencing was on the board, as were all other individuals, in an individual capacity based on their own competency. So I just need to say that you weren't intentionally doing it, but they weren't representing the OGP or the Department of Finance.
I think I might have used that phrase. That wasn't what I intended.
So
their competency is in procurement.
I think that's fair to say.
Yeah.
But there were procurement experts hired by the board. You know, the Government Contracts Committee was used. So that individual was not the person who was on the board to make the decision about the procurement process. That's an interesting point. They were on the board in an individual capacity for a competency-based board. You have decided, Deputy, I think it's fair to say, because you're back talking about building these houses, but you have decided that the GMP process, in your view, was the wrong way of doing it. You said you wouldn't do it that way. You wouldn't build a complex, a project like that. You wouldn't build a house like that. You definitely wouldn't build a house like that. I'd argue that the evidence available so far suggests that it was the appropriate model to use for a complex project. The Mazars report seems to think it. The Government's Contract Committee seems to think it. The National Paediatric Hospital Development Board seems to think it. Let's see what PwC seems to think. But at the moment, there isn't an expert view available to me that it was the wrong approach to take. That's not to say that there haven't been significant problems. There's yet to be an expert view that was the wrong approach, but I await the outcome of that. Lessons learnt. I think in many ways, putting in place competency-based boards and new structures like this were learning the lessons of the past, but clearly things still went wrong. For me, the most obvious thing that has been lacking, and the lesson that we need to learn, is the lack of an adequate early warning system. And I think that's the real frustration that I have as a minister. It's the frustration I think that the government has. I'm sure it's the frustration that you all have and the taxpayer has, that we heard about, and I believe it was disclosed to me very quickly by my department as soon as the problem arose, no question in relation to that. But the fact that there wasn't early warning systems, that there weren't flags coming up the line through all of those various structures is my current significant concern, that these things weren't flagged earlier. Let's see what PwC says in relation to that. But I do envisage that there will have to be governance changes here, and I will act on that when I get the PwC report.
Minister, thank you very much. We're now going to bring in Deputy Alan Kelly for 5 minutes.
Just that individual is there, who we won't name, who's there from a tendering procurement point of view. We absolutely guarantee that individual, because you've both said you informed the Taoiseach in November, you informed the Taoiseach deeper in November, whether formally or informally, I don't mind which, that individual works in the Department of Finance. And that individual never went back to the Department of Finance, which is now merged with Deeper, and said, actually, lads, we have a big problem here.
You understand I can't speak for
I know, but I'm just posing the question. It would seem bizarre, unusual. This is a national scandal. And no reflection on the person, but it's just the position that they're on and where they work. It would seem bizarre. Let me just get this straight. As far as I understand it, in November, you found out in August, we've gone through all of that. In November, up until November, the Department of Taoiseach and Deeper, or Finance, hadn't a clue about this. Is that an accurate statement?
I can't speculate on an individual, but what I would say is...
But there was no communication between the Department of Health at a political or administrative level with anyone in Deeper or Taoiseach, or for that matter, any other department, up until sometime late November, or middle of November.
Well, the definitive outcome, and it's important that...
No. Please, Jim, sorry, Secretary General.
But that is the case. You have a commercially sensitive process. I'm just talking about the roles of different board members and so on.
I didn't intend asking this question. It's purely because of the last question. Very clear here now. Think about the answer. Was there any formal or informal discussion, correspondence in any way, shape or form with the Taoiseach's department, the Department of Finance or Deeper, or indeed any other department? I couldn't see why there would be another department, in any way, shape or form until mid-November, politically or administratively. And I know you can't take account for that person who sat in the committee.
So my guess is with the Department of
I
Public...
don't want to guess. I want
with the
facts.
Department of Public Expenditure, probably during October, we would have been saying this is under pressure. But we weren't in a situation where we've ended up, which is...
This is like pulling teeth, Chair. This is new information again now.
It's not new information.
It is new information, because I asked this question earlier on, and I was told...
You asked the question of informing the Taoiseach.
Well, so no, you did inform the Department of Public Expenditure in October.
We didn't officially inform them, but you've asked informally and did nobody know and so on. I would have said that we were concerned, as we rightly should have been during October, as to where this was going to end up. And I would, in the daily interaction between civil servants, expect somebody to pass that concern across
And
to
what
people.
did DPER say back to you?
We would have told them that we were finishing out the process, that we hadn't got a definitive
Did you mention the
position.
phrase 200 million?
I would have said it was under pressure. I can't say that we had an explicit outcome at that stage, so I don't know what. But if you're asking me, would somebody in DPER have sensed that there might be cost pressures within the Children's Hospital, that wouldn't be a shock to me if somebody said, yeah, and towards the end of October, people in DPER were saying this could be under pressure. That was the view within the department.
What I want to know is when they knew, and how they knew, and what the formal process by which they knew, because in the documentation that you provided us, October and DPER isn't in it.
So we can check the records in relation to that, but you're also asking me informally, and I'm trying to be honest with you on how things happen.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. But it's just more information that wasn't provided. I was very much taken by the reviews that went on between August and December. Okay? And I'm very much taken by the Secretary-General's honesty about where he said, while he wouldn't change certain things, he would change certain actions. Right? I mean, I know from the other committee meetings, like the electrical and mechanical issues here are what escalate. I asked Mr. Pollock to break down how this figure came about in August 2018, and it was the 983 million, plus the 200 million, plus the VAT, plus the urgent care centres, plus the issues with 2 contractors. That brings all of this up to the figure that then it escalated to, and which it then now has escalated further. But down the line here, across, there's 3 committees, 3 boards/committees. There has to be groups who are in charge of electrical, mechanical, and other areas. So that's their silo, that's their responsibility. Why weren't they flagging something here? And ultimately, if PwC doesn't get down to what that was, then we're all being taken for fools. Well, let me finish.
Yeah.
The second issue there is when you flag about early warning systems. Yeah, and this is it. It was quite clear to me from the evidence given by Mr. Costello and Mr. Pollock. You had electrical and mechanical engineering as 2 huge cost base that popped up. But also, it's very amazing, once the user engagement process with the 3 hospitals and the representatives finished, it's obvious that the costs went up as well. So when you're talking about early warning, are you talking about early warning in relation to all of those aspects, like user engagement, mechanical, electrical, or are you talking about other things? Because I thought it was a very honest statement from you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Kelly. Minister or Mr. Breslin?
So on the early warning, and it's in page 2, the user engagement is 21 million of the pressure. I'm not trying to limit the significance of 21 million as an amount of money and something that you could use for other purposes, but in the context of the whole shift in cost, it's a modest amount of the explanation. And therefore, it's not that users were getting around and saying, we want more of this, we want more of this. It's much more likely they were saying, you've left something there that's absolutely essential. The mechanical and electrical is a huge part of what PwC have to look into. We have design team membership with expertise in mechanical and electrical. We have the billboard themselves. And we have, through that process, quantity surveying and trying to identify if something is found to be omitted, what's the cost of that? If something is found to be additional, what's the cost of that? What we are told is the mechanical and electrical work packages, the costing of them, was the last to be resolved. And what that led to is the very sudden increase towards the end of the process.
It was so obvious. I asked the question, and I'm not going to take up any more time. It was so obvious. You're dead right. This is where it's going to, and people are going to have to be held to account who are over those areas. I asked the question, how did they go to tender and get costing for cabling? They did. There's only one problem. They didn't quantify the amount of it. And there's where a lot of your costs are going to end up, and that's where PwC, I can predict, are going to end up finding.
And you can see, Deputy, on page 2, where I've tried to break this down in a way that people could follow. For increasing quantities, mechanical is 31 million and electrical is 23 million for just increasing quantities alone. For omissions, things that are needed but actually weren't in the bill of quantities, 3 million for mechanical and 12 million for electrical. So a very significant component. And then you'll see on table 2 that the overall increase in mechanical is 65% and the overall increase in electrical is 60%.
Thank you, Mr. Breslin. Now, we have 4 remaining contributors, Minister, before you leave. So, Deputy Durkan, Deputy O'Connell, Deputy Boyd Barrett and Deputy Healy-Rae, 5 minutes each. Deputy Durkan.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm
forward to Deputy Durkan, sir. I did come in earlier and indicate that I had to go over and come back. So I don't understand why I didn't get in on the end of the first round.
Well, Deputy Boyd Barrett, I'm giving committee members priority who sat through the entire meeting.
I understand that.
Yeah, thank you. But so, Deputy Durkan.
That's not the question I asked, Chair.
Deputy Durkan.
No. Mr. Chairman, I'm sort of glad that it wasn't the Dáil committee that carried out the evaluation and the programme, the detailed planning of the hospital. I think it would take some considerable time longer than it has actually taken. No reflection either on the Dáil committees or on the hospital board. I think that this briefing document that we received today more or less follows along the lines of what I requested, Mr. Chairman, at last week's meeting, and I thank the group for that. The increase in costs, one of the things is, and it's fully explained. It's all fully explained, and the question is this: that the costs, outline increase in costs, February 2017, a final project brief and business costs was 983 million. November 2018, guaranteed maximum price 1.433 billion. The question is this: where is the figure 1.7 billion coming from? Can somebody tell me that? I think I know where it is, but it would be useful to have, so that we don't find ourselves in this similar situation a few months down the road.
So the bits outside are the bits that are unconnected with the building and equipping of the hospital, but will be required for all of the facilities and services to be there when the hospital goes live. So the bits outside of it include, I'm just getting them here now, the transfer of services, so the upgrading of staff and the commissioning, the movement of from the existing hospitals across. So we're going to have some costs attaching to that. We're also going to have a cost attaching to the electronic health record, which the Bill Board are not delivering. It's being delivered by the HSE. And the other cost is, there's one more significant bit.
We have another cost that is part of this overall investment, potentially, is in the Children's Research and Innovation Centre. The proposal is that would be funded through non-exchequer sources.
And we'll give you a breakdown from 1.4 up to 1.7, but they're not capital building costs.
Yeah, I'm aware of that. And I'm not going to go on any longer, Chairman, don't delay the committee meeting, but I do want to say this, that having had some experience in relation to similar projects in the past, there is a tendency for all such projects, particularly in times of inflationary building situations, to at least double the cost. And that's just a sad reflection. I'm sorry that Deputy Stephen Donnelly is not with us, but he did make reference to the Karolinski project in Stockholm, which went from 14 billion in a 2-year period, 14 billion kroner to 60 billion kroner in a 2-year period. So there is history there that we need to be aware of in relation to hospital projects. In relation to the one he mentioned last week was the Grand Victoria in Adelaide, it had similar problems. So it is endemic in hospital projects. And I can understand some of the reasons for that, because each item has an inflationary tendency. The construction, the mechanical, the electrical, everything has an inflationary tendency. And I would hope that the review that's taking place now, that it identifies any fat that shouldn't be there. But I would be cautious in case that somebody decides that maybe we should bring the project to a halt and as a result save money. That's not going to save money. That's going to spend money unwisely. That is also going to deprive the children of this country of the kind of services that are internationally required at the present time. And my last question, this is a question. If we, for some unknown reason, didn't go ahead with this project now, where would we be likely to gain access to a similar standard of treatment in terms of modern paediatrics? And for instance, Great Ormond Street or Sloan Kettering, or where are they? What are the options?
Thank you, Deputy Durkan. Minister.
I'm really pleased you made that point, because some members of this committee have here and in media commentary suggested that the solution to the problem are things that would halt the project. So, I mean, some of the suggestions have been made by people here to halt the project. The project is not being halted. We're contractually committed to delivering the project, and I'm really proud that this hospital is going to be built. And I guarantee you, in years to come, when kids are being treated in this hospital, and indeed in months to come, when kids are being treated in the Donnelly Urgent Care Centre, which will open this summer, parents and their children will start to see the benefits of this. That's not to take away, no one's trying to take away from the very significant issue with the overrun. But they can't constantly be conflated. They can't constantly just try to dismiss all the clinical benefit. And if people want to continue to measure the cost of this hospital purely in the basis of beds, it is showing a massive ignorance in relation to paediatric healthcare. Because we actually, try to keep our kids out of beds. So the measurement per square metre is actually the way to go in relation to this project. And if you actually, and if you actually look at it, in relation to the square metre situation, you see how this project compares favourably with a similar project to be built in London, and you'll see how the international benchmark shows the benefits of this project. So, people are coming up with different ways to try and land headlines in relation to this situation. And that's not to take away from the very serious and legitimate questions on the transparency piece and the accountability piece. This project, nobody in this room will regret the decision to build this project. What we would regret is pausing a project and delaying it and depriving another generation of Irish children of world-class paediatric healthcare. Because to answer your second question, Deputy Durkan, there is no other facility. So, we have a number of adult hospitals. We don't have a national children's hospital. It's the first time we're going to do it. And there are serious questions that others need to ask as to why during the time of the last economic boom, this hospital failed to be built and €40 million of taxpayers' money was squandered on a site that never got planning permission.
Thank you very much, Minister. Now, Deputy O'Connell, thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. I have to say I agree with you, Minister, again on that point. I've heard a lot of commentary. Only this morning someone told me how much a five-star hotel bedroom was. So we're not building a hotel. It's a completely different animal here. Just to get back to the cross-government committee, the contracts committee, that between 2014 and 2016, and just to paraphrase from earlier on from the briefing document, that this was the best type of contract to deliver a project like this. I suppose just to follow on from Deputy Durkan, it seems to me that it should have been clear at that point that the price, that I know we're starting from a base point of 983 here, but the first price, the 650 or whatever it was that it could never, based on this type of contract, that could never have been the final price. And it just would have been much easier if from the start people were clear about the elasticity in the second phase of the hospital. I suppose, can I just ask a very simple question? Are we getting something better in 2022 than we thought we were getting 10 years ago? So essentially, are we getting a better product for our children, which will lead to potentially, I know it's very hard to quantify, better outcomes for our children with what's on the table today, as opposed to March 17 or June 16? Maybe perhaps Mr. Breslin, you might be able to answer that question.
So yes, I think is the answer. Over the course of it, this project has been really refined. Clinical input has influenced the building that will be built and the facilities that will be in it, and that has accelerated once the decision to pick the St James's site was taken. We have seen a massive coming together across the 3 hospitals of the clinical community to try and put best practice into this hospital, and I have no doubt that what is being built now is superior to what was originally contemplated. On the first question you asked, which was around this 2-stage process, I will be frank with you on this. When my department went to government in 2017 on this, we were not informed by the development board that there was a potential for an escalation in cost of this order of magnitude. Had we been, we would have advised government that the 2-stage process could produce a result like this. And I do think that's a significant deficit in how we've communicated this and in how government has been informed and how the wider public has been informed. To be fair to the individuals involved, and I think they've said this to the committee, that is not necessarily the 2-stage process itself. If the design in the first stage was it was to be an approximate design, if it had approximated the final design, in other words, if it had been short in some areas and high in others, we still would have got the hospital in or around the cost that the stage 1 produced, that the original tender produced. What's happened is that in some areas, particularly in the mechanical and electrical, as we've talked about, and also in other aspects, it has been significantly under-provided against the final design. So there was almost a systemic problem in the preliminary design, that it tended towards under-design to a significant degree, and that has led to a very sharp and sudden cost escalation as the final design gets fully costed through the GMP process.
So the cross-government contracts committee decided on this being the best way of going about it.
Well, sorry, in fairness, the development board decided that, and then they had to go to the government's contracts committee.
Yeah. The development board decided that. They went to the cross-government contracts committee. They said this was the best way of going about it. They came to ye in 2017. Ye agreed with them, but at no point they said, we've looked at this in other jurisdictions, and sometimes when you don't do the full design on day 1, you can end up in a situation where it could go, maybe the figures Deputy Durkan quoted. So ye weren't informed by this competency-based board of the deficiencies or possible hurdles that ye might. So how were you supposed to make a decision?
Now, I don't believe they believed we'd end up here, but certainly the risk, the identification of risk and the development of the design and the contingency around that was not sufficiently articulated that we could have this.
Sufficiently articulated or articulated?
Articulated.
Articulated. So at no point did they say this way of doing things sometimes can end up in a situation like we're in today?
Absolutely. The magnitude here is so great that...
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Deputy O'Connell. Now, Deputy Boyd Barrett, thank you.
Chair, I just wanted to clarify whether I can get 10 minutes, because I did come over for the first. I had to leave to go to do questions, which I signalled to you before I left.
We're giving non-members 5 minutes. Thank you. So, you can proceed. Yes.
Minister, do you understand the rage and fury that the public feel, and maybe that nurses feel, when you say you can't afford to give them a pay increase, which they're having to go out and strike now in order to achieve, but that you're going to wear a situation where the price tag, which will be paid for the public, for the National Children's Hospital is 250 to 300% higher than it was on the original tender. Can you understand the rage and fury and the double standards that people feel are at work there? And do you think somebody should be held accountable for this, right? That's my first. Should somebody be held accountable? Now, the second question I have in relation to that is, do you think that whoever selected the particular building contractor in this case has questions to answer about that building contractor's record? Because this is not the first time that that building contractor has massively overrun, both in this country and abroad. Is the Department of Health aware of BAM's history? It's on the public record. I'm not saying that anything that isn't in the public domain. In Ballyfermot, they built a leisure complex. There was a major dispute with Dublin City Council over a cost overrun there of €27 million. I believe the tiles are falling off the swimming pool as well, just to add insult to injury. In Holland, BAM built a multi-storey car park that collapsed, and then it was a protracted battle with the Dutch authorities, and a settlement had to be reached over the costs of that. In Cork, an arithmetic mistake by BAM led to an additional 12 million price tag for a job in the old Cork, Beamish, Crawford. Sorry, that was Rinnaskiddy with the Port of Cork Company. And then in Cork, we have the Beamish Crawford Brewery. The price tag was 53 million, but then they asked for an extra 12 million. Okay, this is the right. In Cambridge, BAM put a cost for the guided busway at 116 million, and then it came in at 152 million. Now, do you think that a company that has that sort of record, that there are questions to answer, how they could have been selected? Well, sorry, I haven't finished.
Well, you have
sorry, just
5
let me
minutes
finish. Just let me. I would like to get these questions.
For your questions and answers, just to put you on
do you
notes.
think? Do you think that should have raised? Should the fact that their bid was 120 million lower than the next bid have raised flags? And was there a simple comparison done on the costs that were included in there? And the last question is this, Chair. Who selected the board who made all these things? And did we look into their record in this regard? Mr. Costello, who seems completely unconcerned and says BAM's tender was professional, himself had to leave CISCs after a mess-up in Poland for road projects.
Thank you, Deputy.
Where there were significant cost overruns that weren't estimated,
Deputy,
which nearly led CISCs to go bankrupt.
Minister.
Well, thanks very much. So firstly, I suppose ministers don't award contracts, and if we did, you'd be asking.
But you select the people who do.
We'll get to that in a second. But you'd be asking me much more serious questions. So, EU procurement law dictates that companies can apply. There's a procurement process. People can't be excluded from that process. You are right that I think it's a cause of great concern for us that you see on a number of projects extra claims coming in all the time. It would be the easiest thing in the world for me, Deputy, to say to you that I think that's what's behind this. I actually don't think that's a large part of this. And if you actually look at the breakdown in the costs overrun, there's significant other elements at play. So I don't think it's as simple as perhaps in other projects where we could say there was actually a load of additional claims lobbed in. I genuinely don't. Who selected the board? The original National Paediatric Hospital Development Board, to the very best of my knowledge, was appointed by government on the recommendation of my predecessor, Minister O'Reilly, in 2013, and was reappointed by me for continuity in 2017, or 2018, my apologies, last year. And when I reappointed that board, as I said to colleagues earlier, I did point out in the letter to each of them, their appointment letter, that we'd be passing the new law through the Oireachtas, which we just did before Christmas, Children's Health Ireland, and that would give me the power to replace that board if I choose to do so. And I'll be considering my options in relation to the future of the board and the governance of the project when I receive the PwC report. I'll be guided in relation to this. What I do want to say about
But are you suggesting from that the overruns are acceptable then?
No, completely not. Completely not. I'm just saying I can't buy into your narrative of how we arrived there, because, and as I'm saying, it would be very politically convenient for me to do it. It would be very helpful if I was to say, well, we had a project and it was all budgeted, and then this awful company came in and lobbed in extra complaints. That'd wrap it up all nicely in a bow.
No, I'm saying they deliberately under-budgeted to get the contract.
What I'm saying is,
and there wasn't proper scrutiny of their bid.
What I'm saying, when you actually look at the reasons behind the overrun, I think the reasons are far more complex and far more numerous than a situation of any company putting in additional claims after bidding for a project. But let's see what the PwC report suggests, but I genuinely believe that to be the case. And I'll make decisions on the future governance of the project.
And Deputy Boyd-Barrett, it is not acceptable that you make charges against somebody.
I didn't make a charge.
Well, you did make a charge in relation to Mr. Costello.
I simply said that it's stated a fact.
It's not acceptable to criticise somebody who's not here. I'm just bringing that point to you.
Criticise. I just asked, did we look into his own record? And it's on the public domain that he was involved in a project in Poland where there was big overruns. I read that in the newspapers. I just Googled it.
Deputy,
Irish Times, paper of record.
Deputy Healy-Rae, finally, the final contributor, Deputy Healy-Rae.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I suppose I like everyone else, is very concerned with this unmitigated mess where the cost of this hospital is practically being doubled. And I suppose I'm worried about a number of aspects, and I suppose the first, who decided that only 5 contractors were to be shortlisted, and who actually decided the procurement rules or the ground rules for starting off this tender process? I suppose that's one very important question. And I suppose when one contractor was awarded the Phase E part of the work, were they then also the only contractors allowed to tender for the second stage, for Stage B? Because if that's the kind of the story, and that's as I understand it, so they're able to increase the costs day after day if they're the only contractors. I mean, that's not a fair way, or not fair on the taxpayers of this country, that you select a contractor for Phase A and then allow them to proceed with Phase B for whatever price they come up with. That's the other question. And the Department of Public Expenditure, I mean, is there anybody really accountable for what's happening here? I mean, the PwC are to come back with a report, and it's a costly report. It's going to cost us almost 500,000. 500,000. They do a lot, Minister, with services and with the provision of our community hospital in Killarney. It would build. I hope to build 2 of them. But you see, I need to get an answer as to some contractor. It looks to me like it was BAM was awarded Phase A, and then there was no one else allowed to compete for Phase B. Is that right?
Thank you, Deputy Healy-Rae. So you have a number of questions there. So, Minister, or
I can take a couple. Mr. Breslin. So to the first question, which was why were only 5 allowed to tender, the pre-qualification stage shortlisted 5. So people indicated their interest, they indicated the calibre of their work and so on, and then 5 were shortlisted for the full tender process, and the 5 best were shortlisted for that. That's the first answer to your question. The second question you had was in relation to the Stage B process and the contractor that was selected for Stage A. So this was played out at the committee in its previous hearings, but it's important to understand that at the Stage A process, all of the 5 tenderers tendered both for the Stage A works, the basement works, and for the Stage B works. And they did that based on a draft design with an estimated bill of quantities. One contractor is then selected for the project. At Stage B, they have tendered their prices already for each element of the bill of quantities. At Stage B, the design is finalised and the bill of quantities is remeasured. At that stage, if there is an increase in the quantity for any particular item, they have to supply it at the competitive price that they tendered in the original tender. Their price hadn't been judged to be better than the other 4 tenderers. And at that stage, a guaranteed maximum price is concluded, which is a combination of their original prices that they competitively tendered and the final bill of quantities at that stage.
Do you think that was a mistake to confine the amount of contractors to just 5 that were allowed to tender? Because in a scenario like that, when you whittle them down, 5 is a very small number, and you can find that some of these contractors are actually not competing with each other, they're actually working together, because one knows the other won't have the capacity to do the job because they're busy elsewhere or they have other contracts secured. Do you find that that's compromising? Would you agree that that would compromise whoever is paying for it, and that being the taxpayer in this case? Would you have a concern there?
So, and that's the last question I can allow.
At the outset of the procurement strategy, there was a lot of thought given to how we could engage large-scale construction companies to come in and compete for this, because there's actually a really limited number, not just in Ireland but in Europe, a limited number of companies with the capability to deliver a project at this scale. So arguably getting 5 into the race was a reflection of the amount of engagement that happened and the design of the procurement process to encourage them to come in. So I'm not sure that I would agree with you, the 5, if this was a very small project, yes, and loads of builders could do it. But actually, there's very few people who have the scale to deliver something this size.
Can I just ask one other small question? One other question, Chairman. Would you agree with me that if the site was, if the hospital have been built on a greenfield site, that there would have been much less cost in extracting materials out of the site and getting materials into the site, because I and many others believe that that's where the exorbitant cost is, in the confined space where it's being built, and the difficulty in getting materials in and out of this place.
Healy-Rae. So finally, Minister.
As I said to Senator Mullen, Deputy Healy-Rae, the location of the site, the primary reasoning behind that has to be clinical outcomes for our children, and the idea of co-locating a hospital with an acute adult teaching hospital like St James's, and indeed a site that will have a maternity hospital tri-location in due course, was the primary objective. I also don't believe, for the purposes of these conversations in relation to the overruns, that it's a relevant point, because 983 million was the cost on the St James's site, and this is still the cost. We're still comparing it with the current cost on the St James's site. So I suppose that's a slightly long-winded way of saying no, I don't believe that.
Final point too, Deputy. I think Mr Pollock, who's the project director at the committee in the previous proceedings, said that the Stage A works, which are the groundworks and the basement works, are delivered on budget. So, like, one of the things in moving into a brownfield site would be that those works could actually, you could run into some risk on ground conditions, and it could end up costing you a lot more. Based on what Mr Pollock said, that's not the cost escalation reason that we're faced with here.
Thank you.
Would have cost a lot less as well.
Thank you very much, Deputy Healy-Rae. So on behalf of the committee, Minister, I'd like to thank you for coming in. I know you're on paternity leave, so thank you very much for coming in and giving us your time. Mr Breslin, on behalf of the Department of Health, and Ms Fionnuala Duffy, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you.
This committee meeting is now adjourned until tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, when we will examine Brexit issues in relation to health.